Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right. How you guys doing? Last week of school, last week of summer. We got 2 more discussions and you guys will be done with me. Okay. Let's get this thing going. So, does everyone have their assignment turned in now, with the exception of the couple of people I spoke to already? Is that all good? Everybody got that all wrapped up nice and tidy? What are y'all still asleep?
And I turned mine in.
I
I
think
don't know about
mine's
anybody
good.
else.
Good. This is a discussion, folks. Let me share my screen here and get this thing going. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Hey, do you guys see this tile when I move it around the screen, or is that just me?
No tile.
Okay, good. Because I'm always worried if it's in the way and you guys can't see something, it's blocking something I'm trying to show you. Okay, good. Let's get rid of all this stuff. Hey. I want to go back to my modules page. There we go. And I want to just point out where we're at. So we're going to do lighting fundamentals today. I'm going to talk to you about the basic 3-point lighting approach. It's very simple, but a good place to start when you are on set with a camera and you're about to record something and you realize that maybe the lighting could be a little bit better, or for exposure reasons, you might need more light. And when you add more light, you realize that it needs to be shaped and controlled. Otherwise, it's just adding random stuff to the shot that doesn't really help. Show you a couple of interesting apps and talk about a few cool things, and then I'll let you go. And then Wednesday, our last session together, I'm just going to talk about composition and design as a precursor conversation for any of those folks who are then moving on to cinematography 2. For those of you who are only taking this course and not moving further along in the cinematography track, it'll be enough of a conversation for you to sort of get a sense of where the cinematography wants to go in a production that you might be working on. So this is Wednesday's conversation. We won't have a class time that I can dedicate to review for the final, but there is a review video that I did last semester, and it's on YouTube. And so I can give you guys the link to that, and you can watch a review lecture session with me on a pre-recorded Zoom video. And that can help you if you need a little extra help studying for your final quiz. And then we'll be done for the summer. Okay. So I know it was a bit of a whirlwind, but it seems like most of you have weathered through it pretty well. And so I want to thank you guys for your participation this summer in less than ideal circumstances. So let's move into some discussion about lighting fundamentals. Let me see if there's anything I need to mention out of, I don't think so. I think we can go right to the keynote. So here we go. So here's my new cover photo. This is my razzle dazzle photo done by professionals for me over at Full Sail. This is basic lighting, the 3-point approach. So today I want to talk to you about the idea that so film, video, any of these visual media forms are, at least at this stage in the game, they're still 2-dimensional presentations, right? So we got height and width, and then we have a lack of depth unless we try to introduce depth into the images through, in this case, the creative use of lighting. Okay. So lighting, we're going to talk about lighting as a way of introducing a third dimension into a two-dimensional medium. I want to talk to you about where some of the inspirations for our lighting style come from, vis-a-vis sources like classic art. And I want to identify the components of three-point lighting in the form of three specific lights or positions of light. And then I want to talk to you about a nice app that I've got, another app that you can use to experiment with lighting, kind of like the depth of field simulator that I showed you guys a couple of weeks ago. I've got one for lighting now where you can practice your lighting without having to have, equipment and assets at your disposal. You can do it in a virtual space, which is really a lot of fun.
I
Um,
tried it out. I kind of went through the notes and then I tried out the simulator thing, and I did kind of like oh, I'll just check it out so I know what all the buttons are, and then I had to stop myself because I could have gone on for like 3 4 hours with that thing because I'm just like, wow, this is really good.
Good.
It's kind of
I'm glad.
insane.
I'm glad that you enjoyed it because that's the whole point. I want this. If you've got to practice this stuff and you got to spend a lot of time doing it to get good at it, um, you know, ideally it's also going to be fun. Otherwise, you're not going to want to stick to it. So let's think about this. Let's break it down. So lighting then is another one of those nonverbal communication forms that we can take on with our cinematography and really help the director tell the story and make the story themes resonate, to help with performance, to help with audience engagement, cinematography, and I think there's really two aspects of cinematography that are really working hard in the nonverbal communication realm to make cinema an art form, and that is camera movement and lighting. Okay, so I take cinematography too, and I focus a lot on camera movement in that session. And in the cinematography one, I can introduce you to lighting because lighting in most cases is more accessible to you than some of the modes of camera support and movement that I talk about in cinematography two. So it makes it kind of a nice introductory conversation. Sometimes you can find really creative lighting in existing environments because it's already been manufactured to feel that way. And knowing how to identify that is a really important skill. And then sometimes we have to add light to existing situations, either because there is no ambient light available or we don't have enough ambient light for good exposure to give our images that robust, fully realized digital file that we can manipulate later and post in correct colors and things. So lighting is a really important skill for a cinematographer, but it's also an important thing for other creatives to understand. Like art directors really need to have a comprehensive understanding of lighting in order to create sets that are going to react well to camera and that are going to work well in terms of color rendition, in terms of available light, in terms of creating an environmental feel, a tone. Okay, so production designers, anybody working with wardrobe generally knows a fair amount about lighting because different garments under different light sources have different looks to camera, whether it's the accuracy of the color of the textile itself, or sometimes uh, material surfaces have a different look on camera than they do to the natural eye. So wardrobe people are keen on lighting. Makeup people, most of what makeup people are doing is in response to cinematic lighting or to support cinematic lighting by the way they tone the makeup, or by the way they control highlights in the makeup, or the way they create dimension with makeup to help further along or advance the effects of lighting. So there's lots of folks on set that are using or thinking about lighting that are not necessarily on the lighting crew or on the camera crew. So I want to drive that point home as well. It's one of the most important tools that we have as filmmakers, and it helps us create something that um, Blaine Brown in his textbooks on your bookshelf refers to as visual metaphor. So we can inject meaning into the images that the audience can then decode if they are attentive enough to the layers of story that exist below the surface, if they're looking for context or if they're looking for subtext. Okay. And so good communicating there, good lighting, therefore, is a means of communication other than script or performance. Okay, so there's this cute little sort of limerick that came out of a book that I used to teach from. It's called The Genesis of the Cinematographer, and it's supposedly an inscription that was found in the timbers in the upstairs permanence in the stage in Hollywood. And it goes like this: in the beginning, God made the cinematographer. God saw the cinematographer and said that he was good. The cinematographer saw God and said, "Turn your head so it's backlighted." And God said, "Why? I'm God." And the cinematographer said, "I don't care who you are. Backlight, front lighting is no good." And so God turned his head. And so this is the humorous explanation of the genesis of the cinematographer, somebody who is looking at lighting and the way it renders on subjects in front of the camera and decides what lighting angles work best to bring out detail or to obscure detail, to enhance what's in front of the camera, and to work with the capabilities of the camera to produce our dramatic themed images. So we're going to talk about shape and form and texture in this lighting conversation. And we're going to talk about the idea that in most cases, although not all, but in most cases, flat front lighting is the least expressive, the least dramatic technique that we can use. It doesn't really reveal shape very well. It doesn't help us understand texture on surfaces. And it really doesn't give us a sense of three dimensions. So lighting from the point of view of the lens, in other words, flat front lighting, is something that we want to avoid in most, if not all cases, wherever possible. Okay. And I'm going to show you how texture and form can be implied through the directionality of lighting. So we're going to define depth, and we're going to talk about how we can deconstruct a shot and compose it, arrange it, and then light it in such a way that we get, or we communicate to the audience, a fully developed sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. Okay. And it can also inject mood into a scene. The way we light our images can resonate emotionally with our audience, and we can elicit certain responses from the audience using certain kinds of lighting technique or directionality. Similarly, we had the conversation about how color, simply adding color, can have emotional effects on an audience. Well, sometimes the lighting can as well. So really, dark and dreary lighting supports a horror story very well. Bright and broad and soft lighting supports a comedy concept very well. Dramas have a variety of different lighting techniques depending on the mood or the tone of the story taking place. And so we use our lighting very deliberately to help to reinforce the themes or the tone that story is trying to tell. So there's lots of ways that we're controlling our lighting. It's not random. We're not taking it for granted. It's not just simply pre-existing and we walk into a situation and we say, we have plenty of light, let's just shoot. Under 99.9% of the situations, the cinematographer is going to augment whatever is available to make the look more functional, to change the tone of the look, to change the color, to change the intensity, to change the quality of the light from maybe hard to soft illumination or vice versa. Okay, so the cinematographer is really thinking about that quite extensively. I want to show you this cool little video. It's called Sparkles and Wine, and it kind of illustrates the point of directionality when we're talking about lighting. And it's a simple and quick video. I think it's maybe less than 2 minutes. And the thesis here is that the tone of the shot, the emotional response that you might have to the video has a great deal to do with where the light is positioned around a subject and maybe what color it is. So we have a central subject shot, the lens doesn't move, it stays within the same frame, and the key light source is going to move around that subject, and it's going to go up and down and around, and it does it kind of to an interesting techno beat. And it really, I think, drives the point home that we have to think about where our lights are coming from. The directionality is very important, and depending on what direction and what quality we give those light sources, it can elicit certain feelings or emotional responses from us. So let's take a look at sparkles and wine really quick. Thank you, Nacho Guzman, wherever you are. I think that's a lot of fun. I think that's a neat little video because in a really quick time-lapse demonstration, it's showing you the light is moving and the resulting shadows that are happening on the girl's face. And if it's higher or lower, those shadows can take on different form. He's showing us soft, non-directional front lighting. He's showing us ring lighting that it puts an interesting highlight in the eye. That's an aspect of front lighting with a specific kind of fixture. We're looking at, top lighting, under lighting, colored lighting, white lighting. And, in the course of a couple of minutes, I'm hoping it stimulates your brain into thinking about the ways that we can light our subjects that are gonna have meaning, or we can infuse those images with meaning if we're trying to. So with that in mind, I want to take you back in time and show you some classic representations of Renaissance art that really started to explore and understand the way lighting renders on subjects and the way we see the world. If you go to any of the great museums in the country that have a broad variety of high profile art, in other words, things that you might recognize or may have seen before, and you can look at that material in context to other pieces that are similar and maybe from a similar style in a similar time period, and you can see really a transition of understanding in terms of lifelike qualities of renderings, and that includes the way the light works within the context of the image. And you can see how certain kinds of early art forms were very flat and inexpressive in terms of lighting and dimensionality. And then you can see, somewhere around the late 1300s, early 1400s, where the Italians started figuring out that lighting can infuse these images with a lot of drama. And when you're talking about paintings and tableaus and big compositions that were extolling the glory of the religious fervor and taking audiences that were already passionate about a topic, using that topic as a theme for their portraits and their historical scenes, their depictions, and then using dramatic lighting and dramatic posing techniques and things, which could translate into performance, to really create a new kind of art form that was sort of an awakening. A lot of the early Dutch stuff, they call them the Flemish influences, was a lot of flat, sort of non-dimensional lighting that didn't use a lot of shadow detail in these images, and so people had a tendency to look a little bit like, um, uh, South Park or something, two-dimensional images on a canvas. And then we get guys like uh, Rembrandt who come along and they say, well, wait a minute, that's nothing like what the scene looked like. Especially if you happen to be there and remember the event that was depicted later in a painting. You might say, well, that lacks all of the intensity and the drama of the moment, the way that we felt at the time. And the artist really didn't capture any of that at all. And so they started looking for the answers to the question of drama and theme, and looked at lighting. And Rembrandt was one of the people who became associated with a specific kind of dramatic style. And to this day, we still refer to good basic cinematic lighting, dramatic lighting, in some cases as Rembrandt lighting, because it demonstrates certain qualities of the Rembrandt style that are reproduced in our modern images. Okay, and I'm going to talk to you about some of those specific things. Um, if you look at this image right here of Rembrandt, you can kind of see how it has a warm quality to it. So it's not neutral white lighting that is lighting up this character. It's from 1636. It's a self-portrait. So Rembrandt is positioning himself in front of a mirror and he is recording what he sees. And in 1636, there are very few options in terms of light sources for a guy like Rembrandt. So he was either going to use daylight from painting outside, or he was going to use daylight coming into his studio through a window, or he was going to use candlelight and candle fixtures to illuminate his subjects. And I think in most cases, he preferred painting indoors, and he rendered his subjects as though under candlelight. And you can see how he's paying attention to the way candlelight maps itself onto the face of his subject. In a lot of cases, I think Rembrandt did a lot of these self-portraits just to not only to stay in the practice of, painting and being good and evolving with that skill, but it was also to learn about how light works and how light falls on an object and how you record it and how you make it look realistic. And he was very interested in the three-dimensionality of his painting, how he could, through building up of layers of paint and for using contrast, shadow, and highlight, he could create images that had a three-dimensionality that would almost stand up off the canvas. And if you've ever had the opportunity to look at a Rembrandt in real life, you'll see exactly all of those things happening. You'll see deep layers of paint that truly do have a dimensional feel to them. And you'll see how highlights might stand up higher on the surface of the canvas and shadows lie deeper within the layers of paint. And that, he would start with shadows and background colors first and build off of those values and have the highlights be the highest points in the application of the oils and the pigments. And in this way, the document, the painting itself truly was three-dimensional on a micro level. But when you stand back and you look at it, you feel as though you're in the presence of that subject and not simply looking at it on a page. This is where art books are great for creating awareness of who's out there and who did what, but they're not the best way to see those pieces. The best way to see these pieces is firsthand in real life, so that you can see that there was a deliberate manufacturing effort that was going on with these painters, and that they simply weren't applying flat dry brushes to a situation and had an uncanny knack for rendering. This was manufacturing in a predetermined deliberate way that was giving them these results that they were going for. And this guy is highly notable for his contributions to dramatic lighting specifically in all of his pieces. I went the wrong way, sorry. Here's another portrait, an earlier portrait of Rembrandt when he was a much younger man, 1609. Okay. And if you look at just Rembrandt over the course of his career, you can see his evolution in the way he saw light. So if you look at this portrait from 1636, you see the refined approach, the deliberate placement of his light source. So it's above the eye line of his subject. You can see that revealed in where the highlight lands. The highlight's hitting him squarely on the forehead. Okay. So you can tell when you see a high highlight like that in somebody's face, the illumination's coming from somewhere in that vicinity, right? It's a dead giveaway to somebody who studies lighting, but folks that are just admirers of art or who are patrons of art but don't necessarily pay attention to the technical aspects of the image can still interpret this and see the shape and texture that is derived from that kind of lighting. So he's starting with a single source up high above eye level, slightly off axis. If this leading eye is looking right at the painter, we can think of the painter as the camera. So the eye is looking straight into the camera with the highlight above and to the left, right? And as it radiates down onto the subject, it creates a graded fall off or deliberate pattern in the light that goes from a highlight and recedes into shadow very gently and with, a certain amount of contrast that has, defined spaces of what we call transition, like along the nose and along the chin and lower jaw. And it gently rolls off, we call it rolls off from highlight to shadow. And some of the predictable results are you get this sort of iconic triangle on the shadow side of the face, which we sometimes refer to as the Rembrandt triangle or the golden triangle, right? This is one of the artifacts that are resulting from this deliberate key light placement, the key light being the main light in a scene, the one that's doing the work of illumination and defining color and shape. So this key light that's hitting Rembrandt in that specific position, if you always put the light in that position on whatever subject you're shooting, you're probably going to get this resulting golden triangle. And that's an indication that you're in the position that Rembrandt thought was the perfect placement for his single source illumination. And it'll fall off onto the background and it will radiate into the background, hotter on the key light side of the frame and darker on the off key side of the frame, right? So if the light is to the left of the camera or the painter, this would be the high key side, this would be the low key side, right? Or the off key side. And we're going to see the shape radiating in this direction. Okay. If you look at this earlier portrait, you can see a little bit different dynamic going on. There's a slight hint of a low side highlight on the cheek, but his prevailing technique in this portrait is almost a half light. In other words, half of the face is in highlight and half of the face is in shadow. And what we discovered about this technique in lighting is that half light can do a number of different things for a subject. So maybe in his later years, he wasn't necessarily concerned with how much weight he had gained and how it presented on his face when he painted his own portrait. But maybe in his earlier years, when he was still sort of shedding the baby fat, if you will, a rounder, fuller face is not as flattering with frontal light as it is with side light. Side light can actually have a thinning quality about it that can make a person with a rounder face or a heavier visage appear to be leaner or narrower, right? And so this is a deliberate technique, okay? It can also create deeper shadows on the low side of the composition, on the shadow side of the composition. And the construction of the shadows is the very thing that we're looking for when we're talking about infusing an image with drama, right? So a flat lit image with very little shadow structure doesn't really suggest dramatic themes in the image. But the minute we start introducing shadow, we can start inferring those psychological meanings and imply things about these characters through the simple act of controlling the light and having the audience regard that image in a certain context. And then if you offer them hints in the form of story or performance, you can definitely get the audience to think about specific themes. So you're going to see Halflight in a lot of situations where the characters might be in the midst of internal conflict. So you get that yin and yang sense about the lighting, the highlight side being the side that is considering information and the shadow side being the side that is maybe rejecting the information. And so we have expressed in the lighting the suggestion of a duality in the mind of that character, a character making a decision, making a choice. We can also imply with shadows and specifically maybe half lighting the possible truth or untruth of a situation, right? And depending on how we see that character, if we see that character from the highlight point of view or the shadow point of view, we can imply that that character is truthful or untruthful. So we can start deriving psychological meaning from the style of lighting, just the way we did from the color of the lighting in our conversation last week. Chiaroscuro then is an Italian term that describes the interplay of highlight and shadow and how we control it. Okay. And artists like Rembrandt, Leonardo da Vinci, and Caravaggio were all artists that were heavily into the use of shadow and highlight to create drama in their images and tell stories in their tableaus, not just a documentative rendering, but a rendering that also has a story that it's trying to tell the audience. So here's a Caravaggio. It's Doubting Thomas, or it's the St. Thomas painting from 1601 to 1602, I guess, is when he created it. And so it's telling a story from the Bible. So the Bible would have been, you know, one of the predominant documents of this day and age on a lot of people's minds. They don't have television. The printing press isn't widely distributed yet, so there's still limited media resources available to the common folk. But one of the most broadly accessible documents in that time would have been the Bible. And so the Bible was, and all of the stories in the Bible were fairly common themes that appear, you know, a lot in classic artistic imagery. And so here's one particular story from the Bible, and it's Doubting Thomas. It takes place after the crucifixion, when Jesus supposedly rose from the dead and revisited his apostles, and he still bears the wound from the spear from the Roman soldier that was guarding him while he was perishing on the cross as he was being crucified. And Thomas insists on inspecting the wound in order to verify the validity of this guy who claims to be Jesus arisen from the dead. And so that whole story is depicted here in this rendering by Caravaggio. And so you can start reading in or interpreting the image and the lighting and the tone of this image based on what you might understand of the story and what's going on with these characters in the story. And then you can start making some assumptions about the choices that Caravaggio made in terms of the lighting. So if we were just talking about this image and we lit it very flatly from the point of view of the camera or the painter himself, we wouldn't get these dramatic arrangements of highlight and shadow that we see here on all of the faces of all these people, right? And so you can interpret these things. So half-light, right? I just talked to you about half-light in the self-portrait, about how it can denote feelings of conflict or truth or lie, right? And so now here we are, here's 4 characters in a frame, and 3 of them are in half-light. The light source is coming from this side of the frame. So it's creating a half-light situation if we were thinking about it from the context of the lens, which is here. But if we think about it in the context of the characters, they're all getting hit full in the face, these guys, but they're turned 90 degrees to the camera, which gives them the effect of being half lit. Okay. And the half lighting is speaking to their mindset at the time. So, if your best friend was, captured by, the invading army and taken out and executed and then appeared 3 days later in your basement, you'd want some answers. You'd have a lot of questions. And so these guys are truly, doubting the integrity of the evidence before them, right? They're conflicted, so they're half lit. And there's a lot of shadow in their faces and particularly in their eyes. If the eyes are truly the windows to the soul and the soul is troubled by what it sees, then having deep eye sockets with dark shadows is going to be a psychological response to a story that implies the subject is afraid of what they see, they doubt what they see, they're in conflict with what they see, right? These guys are deeply in shadow because they have a lot of questions. Who is this dude? Is he the real thing? Right? And if this is Jesus, a lot of the depictions of Jesus are with him bathed in light, because the light represents the knowledge or the word of God and the divinity. And so a subject that's well lit or edge lit with golden light, in the case of some of these tableaus, that indicates the deity, right? The divinity in these characters. And so in this particular shot right here, if you look, Jesus is turned away from the light and he's fully in shadow as he allows Thomas, his apostle, to inspect the wound rendered by the Roman centurion and provide evidence of his own validity, in which case that puts him in a mood that's dark. In other words, I come from the light and yet you still need evidence. And so here you are, here's the wound, inspect it if you will, but he's in shadow because he has crossed over from mortality to immortality in the story, and he may be dejected and in shadow because people that proclaimed to be his followers, his true believers, need definitive evidence of his resurrection. And so Jesus is not depicted fully in the bright bathing light that we would normally see him in other images, because this is a situation where he's been let down by his own faithful believers by having to provide that. Look, he's even holding his hand and guiding his hand into the wound, saying, look, if you don't believe me, here it is, right? And this is the story that Caravaggio is trying to tell. But I don't think this image would have been nearly as successful if the light had been placed in a different position. And I welcome your opinions on this, because I want to state this, openly. A lot of this can be very subjective. Okay. So the things that I'm seeing are the result of my training, my own experimentation, and my own evidence and experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't other messages in here that you might see that I don't see. So I welcome your comments on any one of these images at this point, to promote, a more lively conversation.
I actually noticed something, and like I said, this is probably just my opinion on this, but there seems to be a sort of fall off in the lighting as well, where the intensity isn't necessarily being naturally reduced as it goes from frame left to frame right. It's being dramatically reduced to separate Jesus from the other men, because he has this. They're all wearing some form of color, and that kind of takes the tone down. But he's wearing this white. He's got his chest exposed so that it's bouncing off his flesh, and it's allowing Caravaggio to really show the white purity and all this, from Jesus, and be like, yeah, he is separate from them, and even though it is a realistic rendering in terms of texture, the lighting seems to have been fudged a little bit in certain areas. The direction of the lighting is correct, but the intensity of the fall off may have been played with a little bit to heighten one subject over the others.
maybe. But you can test all of this, right? So, I mean, if you go into your living room tonight, well after sundown, and you turn one lamp on in the room, depending on where that lamp is, certain surfaces are going to be brighter. And as that lamp radiates through the room, you're going to see how that light is going to dissipate with distance and volume for the rest of the room, right? And so you can see sort of how light falls off. And we use the term fall off deliberately in conversations about set lighting. A lot of times we're worried about, if I use a light here in the foreground to do something, is it going to reach into the background, or is it going to fall off naturally so that my backgrounds don't have, are not contaminated by what this light is doing here? And if the effect is too strong, can we block off certain amounts of the light happening in the foreground so it doesn't interfere with the effects happening in the background? These are deliberate lighting discussions that we have. And this is the discipline of lighting, is being aware of how light behaves and then controlling that behavior with the types of fixtures and so forth and so on. So in this shot, we also have something that we call indirect lighting, which is you're talking about the light source, pounding Jesus in the right shoulder and then sort of blowing up into the faces of these other three guys. And you can see how, while Jesus's face is in shadow, it's not completely inky black either, is it? Like, look at the shadow on this guy. I mean, he's got a dark beard, that helps, but his fall off along his jaw is radical, and it goes from highlight in a middle toned individual, maybe somebody who's he's not African uh, in nationality, but he's somewhere in the middle, and so he's got a darker skin tone, and the highlight's not nearly as intense as it is on the forehead of this guy, and it's radiating into a deeper, darker shadow. And Jesus is not as inky black, even though he's turned away. Some of this light that's hitting him in the chest and in the shoulder is bouncing up into his face and giving us a little bit of that redirected, reflected light. And that's a very complex concept for a guy in 1600 to understand, when they don't even have electric lights yet, let alone lights for video and film production. So this guy with ink and or with pigments and oils and canvas is building compositions using lighting that are explaining very complex techniques of photometrics, we call it, the study of lighting and how fixtures produce light. The photometrics of this painting are very complex, especially for 1601. Okay, so I want you to think about those things. And yes, just like we talked about creating a focal point using depth of field, right? Controlling how much of the image is in sharp focus and how much of the image is in soft out of focus quality to it, especially backgrounds out of focus, foregrounds in sharp focus. You can use the same principles and apply your lighting to that as well. So we have a focal point within this frame as well, by the pool of light hitting the guys, and that light is not extending or reaching into the background very efficiently at all. And so where we get a little bit of separation here, which would imply the directionality of the source, we get a deep shadow over here in contrast to the intensity happening right here on Jesus's right shoulder. And we get what we call separation from the background, which can also happen if we render that background out of focus versus foreground objects in focus. So we're adding another dimension to our creativity. It's not just our lenses now that can help us do this thing. It's also our lighting that can help us do that thing. Whoops, it's not going to let me go back, I guess. Come on. Oh, there we go. Here in this next frame, we can see a charcoal sketch by Leonardo da Vinci. Okay. And this was a study, I think he did this figure study before he started painting the Mona Lisa. So he's thinking about transition lines. In other words, the difference between highlight and shadow, and where the changeover happens, and how drastic is it? Is it immediate and contrasty, or is it soft and gradual? So he's looking at transitions. He's looking at shape as defined by shadows and highlights, right? So the shadow under the chin helps more so than the highlight. The shadow under the chin helps define the shape of the jawline on this woman, right? It's the shadow that is describing her shape, at least in the mandibular region, we might say. And then we have the angle of the light as it strikes the subject. What angle or attitude did that light have, and what resulting highlight does it have, and the difference between the highlight of origination and the shadows that result in the shape from that direction. Very complex concepts in a charcoal rendering on vellum. Here's another Caravaggio. This is Supper at Emma's, and I've put these arrows in here to help describe to you the direction of the key light. And take a look at all of these things and, tell me what you see. So we have 5 characters in the frame. Each one of them is positioned specifically in relationship to the light source. And we can apply different things about each of these characters as a result of the way they've been lit, right? And so we have the caretakers of the inn, supposedly where this scene is taking place. We have 2 companions, and then we have a central figure. That central figure has, implications that one might say, well, this could be Jesus because of the way he's presented. It also bears a striking resemblance to Caravaggio himself, which was something that he did a lot in his paintings, use himself as the main character, and then put that character in a situation and then light it and render it in a way that has dramatic meaning. So we have the central figure. He's telling a story. He might be telling a story about where he's been or where he's going. He might be entertaining everybody at the table as payment for a meal, or he might be explaining that he can't pay for the meal, or we don't know. But what we can do is we can look at each one of these characters and how the light is falling on those characters. And we can, we may feel certain ways about each of these characters. And then we start putting our own story in our minds based on what we're seeing and interpreting from this painting. It's another one from the early 1600s. So the actual storyline, the actual intent of the author, of the painter, in what this image means, may or may not have been lost to history. Did he take capacious notes about what his paintings are all about and explain the story so that anybody who went to see his paintings hanging on a wall wherever they were commissioned would understand the story? Or does he tell us enough information to where we can look at his image and then maybe make our own story in our mind about what we think we see, or about what we think is happening in the frame? It can work either way. Sometimes, like when we have the biblical story of doubting Thomas, that's a story that everybody knew at the time. It was published in the Bible, and everybody had a copy in their house. People were reading it every night, like we watch TV now. Everybody knew the story of doubting Thomas, right? So that was more of a documentary painting, whereas this one, Supper at Emma's, is really kind of a rendering of something that happens all the time. People gather together and they have meals and they talk about the news of the day, or they talk about their crops, or they entertain one another, and they take a meal. And it's in the 1600s, so it's dimly lit because we don't have electricity yet. And it's probably lit by some candle arrangement that's just off frame left. And so it's very moody and contrasty, a lot of shadow and so forth. And how are those figures arranged against the light and against the shadow? And what can we say about them? You see how the innkeepers, they're kind of 3/4 lit. They've got that Rembrandt triangle going on, right? And they're standing, 3/4 off axis to the lens, looking off camera left. The source is coming from camera left, and they're turned in just the right way to where they're getting the Rembrandt style shape happening on their faces. They're also fuller lit on the face. Their shadows aren't as deep and dark. I mean, this side of this guy's face is as far away from the light as the central character, yet he is much darker in contrast. and he appears half lit because he's turning away from his light source. So maybe he's telling a fib, maybe he's lying to these people about how he needs a free meal because he can't afford it. Maybe he's got a pocket full of money and he's not telling anybody. Or maybe he's telling them a tall tale to entertain them, but there's only a certain amount of truth to the story he's telling. Who knows? But we can read into the interpretation of the lighting and say, well, these folks are a little bit more open in their approach to the group. They're just simply there to provide the food and to make sure that everybody gets what they need. The companions who are along with this guy, one of them has his back to the lens, right? So we don't quite know how to interpret that, except to say that he probably doesn't have any information to add, and he's turned towards the central character so that he can get all of the information he needs. This guy is sitting profile to the lens. He's getting half lit by the light source, but he's looking full into the face of the central character. And from that point of view, if we were to take coverage of this scene and put the camera over here and look over the shoulder of this character onto this guy, he would be fully lit in the face. And the idea of being fully lit in the face is he has knowledge. Light represents knowledge metaphorically. And so if he's fully lit, then means he has more information maybe than the audience does. And he might know the truth or the context of this story, but he's not giving it up. He's not creating the spoilers, right? He's letting this guy have his moment, right? There's lots of ways to interpret this shot, this scene, and so think about the lighting and think about what you think about emotionally when you look at these images, because you can create these same techniques in your own cinematography. And so you can get your audience thinking about themes that might be under the surface of this actual script or their performance. The actors say one thing, but they really mean something else. Sometimes the lighting can help us play with the audience in that way. Here's a nice one from Vermeer. Vermeer was one of those guys who preferred the quality of light that came through a studio window. And so he had a studio on, I think it was the third floor of his home in Amsterdam. And he always put his subjects in the same corner of the studio where he could have access to the open window and the sunlight, the indirect sunlight that would come through that window. And so he would always put his subjects in that corner, and then it would just be a difference of costuming and props. And then, man or woman, young or old, big or small, would vary with the props and the wardrobe, but the lighting was always the same, coming from the same direction. But he could achieve all of these wonderful paintings depending on what type of background he used, what kind of textiles he dressed his characters in, and what kind of props they were using. So this is The Milkmaid, 1657. And I've got in here somewhere, yeah, here's the girl with the pearl earring, right? And some of you may recognize this image from the movie by the same name, or the documentary about Vermeer that came out about 3 years ago. The girl with the pearl earring has a dark background. The milkmaid has brightly colored plaster walls that reflect the light almost to the point of whiteness. And in this shot, the light is not permitted to hit the background, and the background itself is probably covered with a black drapery or something that would drink up the light and wouldn't reflect much back. And so we can create another focal point with a subject in the foreground and a background that's black and taking no light at all and receding into infinity or a limbo in the background. And so the eyes are drawn back to the central figure because there's nothing back here to compete for our attention. So this is a deliberate technique, right? And you can do the same thing with your lighting. Caravaggio did it back here at Supper at Emma's, right? We don't know what's back there. We assume that, okay, we see a table with several chairs around it. We see two innkeepers here. We see three guys sitting down having a meal. We can make assumptions about where this is taking place based on the things we do see in the frame, right? And so we don't need to have any real revealing competitive information in the background. The point is they're at the inn having dinner, right? What more do you need to know about the inn? The inn is not a character in this scene. The inn is simply the means of bringing these characters together. They meet at the inn. They didn't meet on the side of the road. They didn't meet at the castle. They met at the inn to have a meal. So we can assume that by the presence of these two people. We don't need to see anything back here. So we can let the lighting go in the background. So we don't need to light anything back there. It's not important to the shot, right? Here is, this is a Metsu, right? But he uses the same kind of window technique that Vermeer was using around the same time period too, middle 1600s. And this is a woman in her toilet. So at the time, the room where the woman would get dressed and have makeup and hair applied and all of that stuff was referred to as the toilet. And so this is a scene depicting a part of life that, some folks aren't privy to. And we can see that there's a little bit more environmental ambience going on in this shot. Metsu likes to give us a little bit of a sense of the background, but he doesn't hang out back there, right? We have enough of a sense of an archway and a little bit of detail on the wall, but there's not a great amount of intricate detail. There's more intricate detail in the middle ground of this image where the central characters are located. This is where he wants you to look. The highlights are present in the middle ground. We have a lot of shadow in the foreground. You can see here, right? Because he's kind of using shadow and the lack of highlight to redirect our eyes towards the center to find this individual right here. This painting is really about this individual. And notice how strategically she happens to be what we call bullets right in the center of the frame, right? Right in the middle. So all of this shadow is sort of leading the eye around in a concentric ring until we get to boop right here. This is the theme of the shot. What is it? This woman is getting ready to go somewhere probably, or meet somebody and have somebody, come to their house. It could be a date. It could be a very important meeting, whatever it is. And she's deep in thought and she's being attended to by her lady in waiting. So she's probably wealthy, right? There are jewels present in the frame that explain possibly her situation. She's also got a musical instrument in her room, which is an indication of, a high society, because you're not going to find a cello in the inn back here. These folks don't appear to have a whole lot of money, right? They're making just enough of a living to keep themselves healthy and fed, but there's no cello standing in the corner, right? Over here, we got a cello in the corner. So the prop is supporting the theme. And then the prop is lit in a certain way to, give us an idea of the expense or the lavishness of this scene. But for all of its splendor here over in the lower corner, it's really only sort of bouncing our eyes back into play like a pinball. Here, yeah, she's rich. Boom, back up here. This is where you're supposed to be looking. This is where you're supposed to be paying attention. All right, so lighting is creating a focal point here. This is really important. This is a section of a much larger composition. And I think this was even 3 panels. So this is Guido Cagnacci, and this is the Martha rebuking Mary. This is what this part of the panel is referred to as Martha rebuking Mary. And so if we start thinking about the concepts I've been talking to you about, and we look at this painting for a minute, we can apply some of the concepts I've been talking about to this image and derive some things about what's happening in this painting. We can figure out the story, right? So what do we got? We got 2 young women, right? In this scene, it's at a palace. There are some symbolic characters. The devil is in the panel here somewhere in the background. There's some young men that are gay and experiencing pleasure and happiness. They're dancing around and they're eating food and they're drinking wine and so forth. Down here in the lower right corner in the foreground, we got these two women, right? And so Martha rebuking Mary is a story. So which person is Martha and which person is Mary? We have to understand what the word rebuking means. And then once we understand what that means, we can look at certain things like gestures and proximity, and we can determine who's Martha and who's Mary. So I think that should be fairly obvious to everybody. Who's Martha?
Martha's the one pointing.
Yeah, she's giving her the finger wag, right? You shouldn't have hung out with that guy last night. You came home hungover, and look at you. You're a mess. Your jewels are scattered all over the floor. You're scantily clad. You must have been up to no good. I'm gonna tell mom. You know, she's giving her the business, right? If we think about this from strictly a compositional standpoint, and we understand that subjects that are higher in the frame than others that are lower in the frame suggest superiority and inferiority, right? So if Martha is rebuking Mary, the assumption is that Martha stands in some authoritative position to Mary to where it's appropriate for her to rebuke her. So maybe Martha is older. Maybe Martha's been down the road a little bit more. Martha's done a little bit more dating than Mary. And so Martha understands the pitfalls and the traps socially of behaving the way Mary has behaved. And Martha is also bathed in light, which would also indicate what? What assumption could we make from that?
That her intentions are good.
Probably, yeah, right? So the presence of abundant light means knowledge, it means goodness, it means awakening, it means awareness, vitality, right? Shadow means lies, deception, bad or evil, sick, unhealthy, regret, all of the negative things, right? So if Martha is bathed in light, wagging the finger in a position higher than Mary, and Mary is in shadow, turned away from the light, meaning she must have done something that was bad. She turned away from the righteousness of the light and did something bad. Maybe she slept with a guy. Who knows? We don't know what it is, but she's in shadow, right? And she's looking up at her sister who's admonishing her for her behavior, right? So we can make all of these determinations by the lighting, by the arrangement of the two characters, by the hierarchy of one over the other, by the absence of light and the presence of shadow versus shape, texture, and fully lit or fully illuminated subjects. And this is what these guys were doing as early as, earlier than 1660. Da Vinci was mid 1400s, right? Oops. Okay, here's one that I really like. This is The Mocking of Christ by Matthias Stomer, 1633. And this panel is also going to segue for me into another part of the conversation about lighting specifically. But what we have is a candle. It's got two flames erupting from it. So it's a double wick candle, which gives it a brighter presence than a single wicked candle. Okay. If you look at any behind the scenes videos about Stanley Kubrick and the making of Barry Lyndon, there's a lot of discussion about candles and how candles illuminate a scene and how they would use 2 and 3 wick candles in scenes for Barry Lyndon. So the candles could be the sources of illumination in the shot as well as being visible in the shot. We call that kind of a light a practical. It's seen on camera as a light doing work, and it is actually providing the source of illumination for the subject in terms of exposure for the camera. So it does all of those things at the same time. This candle is a practical. It's the only light source lighting this group. It's visible in the scene, so we see it, and it's doing all this work. And the arrangement of these characters around this candle are in a radiant pattern. They're all, from the point of view of the candle, they're all front lit, but from the point of view of the lens, they are front lit, half lit or side lit, 3/4 lit, right? We got a couple of people 3/4 lit, couple of people half lit, a guy that's more like, you know, frontally lit, right? And so, and then we're looking at their performance. So they're astonished, right? And or they're in shadow, they're conflicted. And the title of this panel, The Mocking of Christ, okay, is again recalling a scene from the Bible. It's depicting a story that anybody you asked on the street in 1633, if they were Western Europeans, they would be able to answer this question definitively without hesitation. The mocking of Christ. This is, you know, in the midst of the trials and tribulations with Pontius Pilate, where Jesus is being questioned and brutalized, and Pilate has asked him to recant his statements that he's made about being the King of the Jews and about being the Son of God, and we have some of the elder Jewish statesmen that are coming in imploring Jesus. You can see the open hands, like, why don't you just tell him what he wants to hear? You know he's going to nail you to the cross if you don't. Just give it up. It's not worth it, right? And we have other individuals that are, this person looks astonished for some reason. He's receiving information that is maybe changing his mind, maybe the fact that Jesus has said something to draw this individual into the conversation. This guy is clearly sort of fearful of what's going to happen to the central character. He's bathed in shadow, and he has these sort of dramatic gargoyle almost looking shadows that are affecting the way his face is rendered here. And then we have Jesus, who is fully bathed in the light of the Lord, in the knowledge of the afterlife, and the fact that he's doing this for a reason, and he's fully and frontally lit, he's fully illuminated, he knows what he's doing, and he's going to go through with it anyway. And we have all this drama happening within the context of this frame, right? That's from the dramatic interpretive standpoint, the art history standpoint, all of those things, the performance deconstruction. But also this panel explains a very important thing about our film lighting that not a lot of people realize or think about very often, and that is the power of one candle flame in a volume of space that can be defined as a cubic foot. Let's say 1 cubic foot of space, height, width, and depth, the volume of a cubic foot of space that gets illuminated by one candle flame is the basis of calibrating our light meter. So the light meter is based on a method of interpreting the power of one candle in a cubic volume of space. It's called a foot candle. Okay. And not only do cinematographers use foot candles and photographers, but even architects that create the lighting for spaces in hotels and conference rooms and city streets think about and use foot candles, because foot candles help us understand the volume of light in a space and how it will affect the participants psychologically by being contrasty or soft, bright or dim, right? And all of those considerations using foot candles we can have a conversation about that outside of the context of photographic requirements like f-stops and shutter speeds, right? A foot candle is a foot candle, whether you're using a camera with ISO 800 or a camera with ISO 100 sensitivity. But the way you set that camera will be different based on the camera's sensitivity. But the volume of light is what it is, right? So the foot candle is an important thing to understand when we're talking about photography. There's the graphic representation of what I'm talking about. And you can sort of see how we define this as a benchmark for calibrating a light meter, right? If the light meter understands this, then when it knows what the intensity value is for this, and it gets many, many more readings than 1 foot candle, it can start to compute and compare against your ISO requirements and tell you how to set your camera. The light meter is a very important tool in that regard. These other panels that I have separated here are just sort of in close proximity showing you the details created by the Halflight and the broader light and the front light, and then of course the character sitting back there in shadow. And these panels, when I enlarged them, I think got a little bit cooler than they are in the master frame. The master frame is a little bit warmer, denoting the color value of a candle. Do you guys remember what the Kelvin value for a candle is based on our conversation on color theory we had on last Wednesday? I'm looking for a number.
2400.
Keep going down.
I don't know, 500.
About 1900 degrees Kelvin.
1900.
Okay. So 1900 degrees Kelvin is way down there on the orange, almost red end of the color scale. And then of course the opposite end would be the high frequency colors, the blues and the purples, the greens. Okay, so the candle's very warm. It's also very contrasty. So a small light source like a candle flame has a certain amount of contrast inherent in the quality of that light. And if you take that candle and you reflect it into a silver disc, you can broaden out the projection of that candle flame and create a softer contrast. And if you take that candle flame and put it inside a paper lantern, discarding the notion that you can burn the house down by putting a flame inside a paper lantern, if you were to do that, you create an even softer, more radiant source that has different kinds of shadows coming from it than the raw candle flame. So it's also a discussion about the understanding of light sources and whether they are contrasty, hard specular sources like a candle flame, or whether they are broad diffused light sources like a white wall reflecting sunlight, or a window projecting indirect daylight from the sky into a room, or a China lantern with a source inside diffused by paper in 360 degrees, right? So it's talking about the quality of the source, the color of the source, the arrangement of the objects in front of the source, how the shadows are happening. This panel is hugely informative to anybody who studies lighting and cinematography. And it's one of my favorite panels because it's also the discussion of the foot candle. So I love The Mocking of Christ by Stomer for all of those reasons. So the light meter is really important when we're doing our cinematic lighting. It's the thing that's informing us on how we can set our camera. It's removing a lot of the mystery of what's going on now. So I've talked to you about exposure and how to calculate exposure, looking just at the numbers and using graphs and charts to help you interpret those numbers. But really all it's boiling down to is if you use a light meter and you have a light source, like I have one over my head, right? If you tell the meter certain things, the meter is going to help you set the camera. So you're going to tell the light meter what ISO your camera wants to function at. So if you got an Ursa Mini, right, we know that the manufacturer has told us that the Ursa Mini is going to behave best at probably 400 ISO, right? So we would plug 400 into here, right? So if I hold the 400 down, or the ISO button down, I can turn this. You'll see up here, you'll see the ISO change from, it looks like 800 to, am I going the right way? Oop, I passed it. To 400. Now I'm set, my meter is set to 400 ISO up here. I'm set to 24 frames per second. Why do I want to be at 24 frames? What am I doing, presumably, if I'm at 24 frames?
What do you mean?
If I have the camera's frame rate set to 24 frames per second, what can you assume that I'm doing with my recording? What am I doing?
capturing audio as well?
Capturing sound, right? 24 frames, lock it in. I'm capturing sound. Lock in your frame rate, lock in your ISO, right? And then all you got to do is take this Lumisphere and poke it into your light source. The light is coming down and kind of blanketing me from above. I have an actuator button on the side of the meter, which is going to send voltage to the Lumisphere for a brief moment so it can get a reading, and it's going to tell me in the liquid crystal what f-stop I need to set on my lens. Watch this. Bang. And it's telling me 2 2/10. So on my cinema lens, I'm going to set my f-stop on the f-stop ring to f2 or t2 on the lens. And I've just set my camera. The meter has told me how much light is here to make an adequate exposure, to make all this come out with the right brightness, not too bright, not too dark, right? All with this tool. The only thing I have to figure out now is, do I like the way this looks? Because there are things that I can do with that light source that may not change this much at all, but it will change the interpretation of the image. Like, do I want the light to come more from the side instead of the top? You know, do I want the light? This is a daylight balanced fixture. You can tell because, you know, tones look kind of neutral like they would under white light. And if I verify that with a white card, you can see how it's fairly neutral, maybe a tad warm. I think it do have a little warming gel on that. It's not bright white, but it's also not the color of a candle flame either, is it? It's neutral. So it's a daylight source. The camera in my computer is a daylight balanced camera. So the camera and the lighting are in agreement. They are balanced. And it's fairly low contrast and indirect because it's a broad, soft source. It's a big LED mat, and it's hanging over my head, giving me a nice sort of soft top light that comes down and shapes my face fairly broadly and openly and bright, so you can see who's talking to you in the camera, especially when I have a dark background, right? So I'm using some of the same principles, right? I'm using a dark background. Why? Because I feel like you should be focused on what I'm telling you, not looking in the background. I sprinkle a few details back there that are relevant to my conversation. Last week it was an Ursa Mini. Now it's some lights, some LED lights, right? But the predominant background is dark because I want you to focus on this section in the foreground, which is where the information is coming from. So I'm using the same kind of compositional techniques in the lighting as I'm explaining to you, right? So now I want to show you some examples and see what you can read into these images, and we'll play with it a little bit. So here's The Man in Armor by Baylert from 1630, right? And what I find particularly interesting about this image is the degree of complexity in the detail and the accuracy of the information in the frame. This man is wearing metal armor. He's got a fuzzy beard. He's got a big feathered plume, which is an indication of his rank within the structure, the military structure. He's got a bright, brilliant red sort of cummerbund situation happening here. And he's got this, you know, highly polished armor that he's wearing. And look at the highlights in 1630. So we have all these light sources now, all these different ways of illuminating rooms and objects and people. And so it's easy to take some of these things for granted. But if you realize that this guy painted this image in 1630 with only the benefit of maybe window light or candles, and the degree to which he understood how light was going to affect all of the detail and the filigree and this armor and the metalwork and the tooling and the fact that he's going to have a big stretched out highlight, even though the source might have been, you know, a candle or a couple of candles in a group that sort of emitted a basketball shape of light into the room. But when it hit the armor, it got stretched out along the length of the metal tube on the arm and became this long highlight. This is very complex understanding of the way light works on surfaces. And this is out of the imagination of somebody who doesn't even have the benefit of a camera to record that image so they can copy off of the photograph. This is brains and eyes and presence of mind to be able to recreate this on canvas with paint, right? And a modern correlation to this image might be C3PO, right? This was Pete Shashitsky. This is The Empire Strikes Back. Cinematographer Peter Shashitsky. I have Gilbert Taylor here, but that's wrong. Gilbert was from the first movie. C3PO is wearing, a metal suit, right? And so you really have to pay attention to the kinds of lights that you use and the way those lights are going to reflect back at camera in something like a gold metallic uniform, right? So C3PO had to be lit very deliberately in order to have that metallic suit look believable, render without revealing, without lifting the veil and revealing that he's standing on a movie set. So the lights coming from predominantly behind him, right, with a couple of deliberate highlights placed from the lens to reflect back at us and create these hot spots. And then the backlight that's hitting C3PO and R2D2 is reflecting off of the walls and in essence creating giant reflecting panels, because these are white walls that are allegedly carved out of a snowbank. And so the light hitting them is acting like a reflector, the same way that this reflector redirects some of my light onto my face, right? The walls of the ice station are doing the same thing as a giant reflector, and the light's coming from behind, right? Here is Barbieri, and this panel is called The Suicide of Cleopatra. And so it's more traditionally lit, I think. There's less drama happening in the actual light source itself. The drama in this panel is derived more from the props and from the performance of the character, her positioning, right? So is anybody familiar with the story of Cleopatra?
Yes.
And so what did Cleopatra do?
She was the pharaoh. She was the last pharaoh of Egypt. She got into a relationship with Caesar, and together they allied their country, their forces to overthrow the ruler of Egypt at the time, her younger brother, so she could take the throne. And then Caesar was killed, and then she got with Mark Antony, and then she ends up dying. There's much speculation of how she died, whether it was suicide or somebody poisoned her. But she was poisoned by a snake, and that's basically the story that I know of.
More or less. There's some subtle nuance in there. So Cleopatra is married to a very high up guy in the structure of the Roman politic, and she cheats on him with Mark Antony. Her husband is sent to North Africa to supervise a corner of the empire. And while he's away, the wife will play, and she has this business with Mark Antony. Mark Antony is embroiled in this plot to overthrow Rome and the Caesar. The Caesar's kind of preoccupied with his own perversions and his own politics and things, and he's letting all this stuff happen. But it comes out somehow that Cleopatra's discovered in this illicit affair, and judgment is weighed against her, and she is condemned to death. And so they're like, do you want us to execute you? Do you want to take poison? Do you want to concoct your own method of exacting your sentence on yourself? And the legend says that she chose death by an adder, which would be a poisonous snake that would have just a very small bite, and she would coax the snake into biting her, and she would gently pass into death through poisoning, right? And so that's why we have the little snake here that she's pulling out of the basket. We have her adorned in the scarlet garments of the adulteress. We have her dramatically lit from the side. Maybe she regrets the choices that she's made in her life. She's deeply conflicted by what she's done, and she's now in the throes of agony, spiritually and soon physically, by the poison. And so we got all this drama happening, and we just have this one sort of descriptive, warm, hot, contrasty light source that is enhancing the performance of mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, right? And so this is kind of what's happening in this panel, right? So this is, you could think about it on the part of Barberi, sort of minimalism, right? The same light source that's illuminating Cleopatra in the foreground is also spilling a little bit onto the background to give us a little separation and a little detail back there. Nothing to draw our eyes away particularly, just enough for us to sort of understand the time period or the context where she is, right? She's in her home. She's not out in the public square being, executed in front of a crowd. She's in the, the quiet confines of her own palace. She's administering her own prescribed sentence, and she's reflecting on that in performance here. And so, I guess Barberi decided that he just needed one strong light source from one direction that would give him a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little bit of this detail. As light strikes a surface with a lot of texture, if it strikes it from the front, the texture is not fully revealed. If the light strikes and does what we call raking across the surface from the side, you get all of the detail in the folds in the dress to emerge in the presence of subtle shadows that reveal the shape or the topography of that surface, right? So we have this amazing garment that she's wearing, clearly a wealthy individual, has all of these layers of textile and all of these brilliant colors, and the light is coming from the side, so we see all the folds. The more folds in a fabric that a woman of high society has in this era would indicate, she's got enough money to have a dress that's made out of 9 yards of fabric instead of one, right? A poor person has a very thin drape of a garment that's probably not going to have a lot of character and texture to it. And a very wealthy person is going to have multiple layers and multiple colors and multiple pleats and affectations that are going to react very well to a certain kind of lighting, right? So all of this meaning can be derived from the simple application of the right kind of light in the right placement. If we think about that then, and we pick a scene from modern storyline, we might think of something like The Godfather, which has very similar simplistic lighting approaches to it that are very effective. So we have these two men in this scene from The Godfather. This is the opening scene in the first of 3 movies that are going to describe the evolution of an Italian immigrant family into the United States at the turn of the last century, and how they make themselves at home in America, how they integrate into society, how they govern themselves within the context of the overall themes of law and order in America. And they handle things sometimes in their own way, which involves the mafia, the La Cosa Nostra, which is the Italians exacting justice on themselves from within, handling the problems from within, and not turning over justice to the greater society that may or may not rule in their favor, right? And so in this scene, we've got this man who comes to Don Corleone and asks for a favor. And so we have this scene happening in the study in this elaborate home in the suburbs of New York City in the 20s, I think this scene is. His daughter is getting married in the backyard of the house outside. The drapes are pulled over the windows. The environment is very dark. Outside, the world is happy. Young love is being revealed to the family and proclaimed in public. And a party is ensuing. But inside the house, in this back room, in the study, something very different is happening. All right. And the lighting is trying to tell you or give you the context for what's happening in this scene. So this man comes to Don Corleone and he asks him for a favor. And it turns out that this man has a daughter, and his daughter was out reveling on the town, was assaulted by 3 men, sexually abused, beaten, nearly killed. And she's now ruined socially in terms of her sexual violation. She's disfigured from the brutality. And this man happens to be an undertaker, and that's his profession. But his daughter was simply, out with friends having a drink or something, and she ends up getting raped. He goes to Don Corleone and he says, I want justice. And Don asks, what do you want me to do? And he says, kill him. So now we have the situation where the story is very dark, right? We're talking about 2 guys, one with power, one without power. The one without power has been hurt in some way, and he goes to the powerful and he says, give me justice, give me revenge. Right? So the themes of this scene are matched equally with the intensity and the directionality of the lighting. Look at Don Corleone's eyes, and what do you see? You see deep shadows, you see contrast, you see a strong jaw with a set to the jaw that indicates he's a man of resolve, right? And we don't see the twinkle in his eyes. His eyes aren't lively. His eyes aren't expressive. His eyes are in shadow. And the presence of shadow indicates what? Difference between highlight and shadow. What can we assume about that? Anybody, just go ahead and offer it up.
That he's serious in tone or otherwise, not per se evil, but direct, threatening, can be aggressive, but because of his outward appearance, it's something hiding within him. It's something we don't see yet.
If somebody exists in the shadows, what can we say about them? They exist in the shadowy world, in the underworld, right? What is the underworld associated with?
Devilish.
Hell, the devil, wrongdoing, crime. This man is a
Evil.
criminal. This man is an organized criminal. He's a family man. His daughter is getting married. Happiness lies outside the office. Inside the office, he's conducting his business, and his business is antithetical to society. He's a bad guy in reality. He's a bad guy that does things for good reasons, but he still uses tactics that are, in this case, this guy's asking for revenge. He's asking for murder. Don Corleone's eyes are in shadow. We're supposed to understand about this guy that he's powerful, but he's not necessarily on the up and up because we don't see the highlights in his eyes. The presence of light indicates what? Information, virtue, health, vitality. We don't see any of that here, do we? We see the death mask. We see the skull and bones. We see the shadow in the eyes. And we understand that this man is asking this man for something very deadly. Right? And this is how this movie opens, right? So we have all of this drama and all of this metaphor happening in the opening moments of this movie, right? Here's one. This is a great one. So this is Rotari, and it is called Girl with a Letter. And what I want you to do is take a look at what's going on here, and I want you guys to tell me the story of this painting. What's happening? Tell me about this girl, what she's doing. It's a girl writing a letter, but what's happening here? What are we
Well,
supposed to think is happening here?
she's writing a letter. She's looking at, I guess, the camera in this sense, which would be us in our direction. Her face is covered in shadow, so I would say that she's writing some type of deceptive letter. Don't know exactly what the contents is, obviously, because we don't know, what's going on with the character in terms of backstory.
Well, let's see if we can't figure it out. Let's look at the evidence.
But given her attire, her costume, I would say she's obviously wealthy, and that she's got something, some type of deception going on, that some type of plan that would give her what she wants, which I would think is outside of, I would guess is outside of what the life that she actually is living.
And what do you base those assumptions on specifically? What evidence?
Prior knowledge of a lot of a lot of depictions of these type of I guess stories and paintings and things of that matter.
Try to
where
be specific. Try to be specific. What in this frame is giving you those is helping you make those assumptions?
It seems like a Scarlet Letter kind of situation because she's like dressed in red and she's got this knowing smirk on her face.
Okay, so there's two specific things that we can think about, right? So you're hitting all around the right answers. I think it was that Corey that was talking. You're hitting all on the right assumptions, but what I need you to do is tell me where those assumptions are coming from, not from other images, from this one. This is the interpretation of this image. So what we can do is we can look at two things that Miranda has pointed out here. The first is she's in shadow, so that may speak to her honesty, right? And she's looking right into the lens, right at the camera. So when you're watching a movie and the character is interacting with another camera and all of a sudden they turn to the camera and they go, but you and I know what the real story is, right? And then they go back to doing what they're doing. She's kind of doing the same thing. She's given that knowing look to the lens. I'm going to let you in on my secret. She is writing a letter. So who might she be writing a letter to if she is not being open about the context of what she's writing? Well, we can now look at some other evidence. She's wearing a dress. Yes, she's wearing a dress, and yes, it's very elaborate. She's probably a member of the idle rich, right? She has time to sit and muse and think about a letter. To who? Well, if you take this literally, the color red is an indication of what? Passion, love, right? Blood. So she might be writing a letter to somebody she feels this way about. What's more evidence? Here's some lipstick on the table, and her lips are dabbed with red. We can see that in the reflection of the light off the paper into her face, right? She's turned away from the light. She's turned away from righteousness by having an illicit relationship with somebody she probably loves a lot because she's willing to dress herself up with makeup, and she knows it's not right. She's in shadow. Maybe it's forbidden love, or maybe it's love outside of marriage, and it's a letter to her lover. Probably, right? Not necessarily the truth, right? We'd have to ask Peter Rotari what the real meaning of this image was, but I think we can make some traditional assumptions based on the visible evidence of the story of this image, right? And so, and maybe in context to a modern framework, we might talk about, say, this shot right here from Blade Runner, right? What's going on with this character in Blade Runner? Who is this character? You guys have seen Blade Runner, right?
Yeah, she's the uh, synthetic lost love of Harrison Ford's, Hunter character.
You
And
said the key word in your opening
yeah,
statement. She's a synthetic.
right.
In this scene right here, we have now it's Ryan Gosling, right? It's Harrison Ford's uh, uh, the guy who took over for Harrison Ford. Harrison Ford is now like retired or moved on or whatever, and he's and then they bring him back to meet Rachel again after many years, and the real Rachel has died, right? And yet here she is at this guy's hideout, Terrell's corporate headquarters, where he makes robots as a product line, right? And he is, confronting Harrison Ford with what presumably Harrison Ford always suspected, which was that Rachel was a robot. But look at Rachel and the way that she's lit, and the fact that it's soft, it's not hard contrast, it's soft contrast. We want as an audience to be reminded of the love that she felt for Harrison Ford's character, and the fact that despite her being a robot, which presented him with a lot of problems because his job was to exterminate robots that run away, he's confronted with Rachel, and he realizes that she is about as close to the real thing as you can possibly get, to the point where it's very hard to know if she's truly synthetic or if she is fully actualized, fully conscious, right? And the fact that she's been rebuilt and represented to him years after the original model was deceased, is driving the point home. Your girlfriend was a robot, dude, and here she is like 50-40 years later, and she looks the same, and you're all old and on the way out, and she looks as vibrant as she did the first time we saw her. And the first time we saw her in the other movie, she was presented in the same way. She was presented with loving, bathing light that was meant to deceive the audience, to get us thinking, is she real or a robot? I'm not sure, and nothing is sort of giving me the answer. No evidence is making it obvious to me that she's a robot. We spend the whole movie wondering in the first Blade Runner whether Rachel is a real person or a robot, right? And then we even extend that anxiety to whether or not Harrison Ford is real or a robot, right? And then we don't really get the answer to that question in the first movie, and kind of by the end of the second movie, we still don't have the answer to that. Is Harrison Ford also a robot? Did a robot fall in love with a robot, or did a real man fall in love with a robot, or did a real man fall in love with a real girl, and we just got it all messed up, right? So the movie is trying to play tricks with the audience, and is not trying to give us any clues in the lighting. The lighting is disguising the reality. We're trying to see her bathed in a loving human quality of light that depicts her in all of her beauty and all of her humanity, and yet she's possibly not really a human. And in the words of the Terrell character, more human than human, right? So these are how we're treating the modern concepts, in the same way that Rotari was addressing these concepts, 200 years ago, almost 300 years ago. And here's another one. Here is a self-portrait. This painter painted herself, Mary Bouillard, in 1785. And this is how she saw herself, right? How did she choose to light herself? Did she half light herself? No, she probably understood the implication of half light. Did she backlight herself? No. Did she give herself Rembrandt lighting? No. She lit herself full in the face, fully revealing the visage and leaving the details up to the observer to decide whether or not she is beautiful, appealing, whatever. But what she wanted to do was fully reveal herself to her audience and let her audience decide how they feel, right? Bright highlights in the eyes, The light is in what we call a beauty position. So it's a similar position to the light that I'm using here. I need a beauty light because I need all the help I can get, but it's also in that position because it helps shape the face in the most, in a very distinct way, which is, you know, if you watch the Da Vinci Code or you study the Leonardo da Vinci and you understand that the V is the universal symbol for the uterus, which is a symbol of fertility, vitality, life, right? And so when you put the key light in a position like that and you are photographing a female, all of those implications are made of the subject, which is the V shape is the shape that denotes femininity. The light is soft and not hard, which might indicate a softness of character or a softness of personality. The eyes are sparkling and twinkling with highlight, which is vitality and life and effervescence, right? Very little shadow on the face, which would denote drama. There should be no ambiguity here. You either like what you see or you don't, right? It's all right here. And I've chosen a modern image from a modern film to sort of, have you think about. And so here's Meg Ryan in When Harry Met Sally. And we have the same kind of character: simple, open, upfront, honest, loving, vivacious, full of life, right? And so we don't use shadows on the face of this character because the shadows might interpret drama to the audience that are in conflict with the story or in conflict with how the author wants us to think about this character. Okay, so she's broadly lit. She's got a soft frontal illumination, which is slightly high, which gives us a little bit of action on the cheekbones, which is supplemented by the makeup department. When they rouge up those cheeks like that, it helps to accentuate the shape that's created by a key light that's coming from directly in front of and above eye line, right? The jaw has just a bit of subtle definition by that high key light, and a lot of what we call fill light, which gets into the shadows and brightens them up so that there's not too much contrast on the face. So this is a high key, low contrast image of a subject in a movie who we're supposed to feel lovingly towards, right? In other words, there's these two characters. They're really good friends. They met in college and they've been friends for 20 years, and they interact socially, they interact privately, they interact professionally, and yet they don't understand or realize their own inner feelings towards each other, which is they're actually two people that are spending so much time together because they're actually in love, but they superficially don't see that. They each have some idyllic vision of who their proper partner should be, and the whole time that they're going through all this stuff in this movie, the audience is made to feel like, oh my God, why don't you two people really see what's right in front of you and understand what's going on, instead of, causing all this trouble for yourselves. And so we spend the whole movie watching these two people drift closer and further apart, back and forth, back and forth. But we want the audience to be in love with her, to ask the question, why doesn't Billy Crystal see that this is the right woman for him? Why does he keep looking for something better somewhere else, when the answer to his lost love problem is sitting right across the table from him they're in Stage Deli, I think, in New York City. So they're having lunch, right? And it's like, so that's the context of the lighting, and the character within that movie is not too hard a contrast, not too dramatic. Keep it light, keep it broad, open, keep it lively, and light her in that way so that we don't have any choice but to see her in the most positive regard. And then here we have The Countess of Keller by Alexander Calbanel, right? And so now we can take this image and apply all of the theory that we've been discussing so far, and see if you can tell me about the Countess of Keller. What kind of person is she?
She looks like she needs sleep.
She's what?
She looks like she needs some sleep.
She looks like she needs sleep. Why?
Her eyes are very dark under them. She's not being, they're not, these shadows are not being filled in.
What kind of person needs sleep? What kind of person needs sleep? All right, what kind of person is sleep deprived?
Someone who's riddled
Me.
with anxiety.
Say that again, you stepped on each other.
Someone who's riddled with anxiety or has a lot on their shoulders.
Someone with a lot of responsibilities, up late burning the midnight oil at work, maybe? This is a woman, though. What's up with that?
Maybe secrets.
What can you tell me about her lighting?
I mean, we can see most of her except a little part of her face, but it's not super soft. It's pretty intense.
Here's Mary Bouillard. Here's the Countess of Keller. What kind of person is this one?
She seems trustworthy and nice.
Maybe a debutante, maybe, you know, she's clearly lit in the strongest female persuasion. So we're made to feel like she's what? She's a mate. She's a wife or a girlfriend. She's all of the things warm and soft and cuddly of a female debutante. She's a possible wife for somebody. Maybe it's at the point of her coming out into society, and she's now, you know, the family is saying, "Hey, this is our daughter, and she's available. Who's wealthy and powerful that wants to marry her?" You know, and she's a debutante. Maybe I don't know for sure, but she's definitely not, right? Her lighting is harder, more contrasty. The sockets in her eyes are dark. We don't see a twinkle like we saw in Bouillard or in Meg Ryan. So it's not that she's not vivacious, but she's stressed out because maybe she's very powerful and she's female, yet she's lit in a way that's very contrasty and in a way that we associate with lighting men, right? So if we're lighting her in a very masculine way and using all of these clues to indicate that she has weight on her shoulders, then she might be a very powerful female who's being depicted in that way. She's not being depicted this way. She's not soft and cuddly. She's hard and powerful.
Well, she's a count, isn't she?
Well, yeah, she's the Countess of Keller. But if I didn't tell you that, this evidence would still be very strong on the canvas that she's not somebody to be trifled with. So it's, you know, and she's even kind of in a powerful pose where she's turned slightly away from the lens. This is a very open and unassuming way to address the lens. And this is a way that's guarded. Your shoulder takes the brunt of any frontal attack. Your heart and your chest are hidden from view. This is a power pose. This is a very open and casual pose. How you turn your character to the lens is very important, and it can say things to the audience, and you got to be sure that what you're saying is not misinterpreted. So if you don't want your audience to feel this way, then you might want to have your actor turn more to the camera. It presents them in a different way to the lighting as well. This way might introduce some shadows and shape that you don't want misinterpreted as drama, and you want this to be the tone, bright and open and honest, or guarded, right? So think about the way you're positioning people in front of your lens and how you're lighting them, or how the light is being applied to them, and make sure the messaging matches the story. So if we think about this kind of lighting in this context, then this becomes fairly obvious to us, doesn't it? And we know what's happening here. This is Black Swan. Darren Aronofsky, Black Swan, right? So this is Natalie Portman, and Natalie Portman is, you know, a dancer in this film. Her antithesis is Mila Kunis, right? And what's going on between those two women in this film, in Black Swan? Have you guys seen it? Haven't seen Black Swan? Film students?
No, I haven't seen it.
Doesn't
My
bode well.
apologies. No.
Film students, you guys should be watching everything you can get your hands on, because it's all input, it's all data, it's all informing you of style and substance and interpretation and story and the way the camera can tell the story with the lighting and the lenses. Two women in conflict for the lead role in a ballet, and this woman is all dressed in black with makeup that obscures her face. What can you assume about this character then?
She's got probably confidence in assertion.
Maybe she's also defending herself against a really strong candidate who's also looking for the lead role in the ballet, Mila Kunis's character, right? In this particular scene, I think she's thinking about how she's going to take revenge on Mila Kunis for trying to steal her job. She was assumed to be the lead role in the ballet, and then the younger understudy comes along who's doing an equally good job and offering a new personage for the audience to admire or follow or start to you know, gain interest in, and she's fighting for position. She's got her war face on. Her light is contrasty. It's coming from predominantly behind her. She's got a hot edge light, and she's got very strong jaw lines and cheekbones. She's wearing war paint. She's dressed in black. She's open for business. She's coming after Mila Kunis to defend her territory, right? This character is very strong and very, well, it turns out that emotionally she's not very strong, but she has the ability to react in a strong way when she feels threatened. And this is threatened mode. This is woman with her cockles up, ready to scratch the eyes out of the woman who's trying to take her job away. Right? You guys should watch movies like this. They're very informative in a lot of ways. And Darren Aronofsky is a very, he's an independent director, came up hard out of New York City with low budgets and guerrilla filmmaking. Maddie Lebetique was his cinematographer early on, and then Maddie grew into this bigger technical persona within the structures of Hollywood and big budget movies. And Darren still makes these fringe films that are heavily steeped in symbology and in traditional themes and traditional drama. And Black Swan is, you know, a perfect example of all of those sensibilities coming to bear on one story. I've worked with Maddie, he's very talented cinematographer, very cognizant of everything that he does. Nothing that Maddie does to his images in camera can be taken for granted. Absolutely nothing is accepted at face value. Matthew thinks about everything he photographs, and he affects everything within that frame with his lenses and his lighting and his camera movement and his compositions. Okay, so here's an example of a cinematographer that is very highly creative, highly susceptible to subtext, and very conscious of what his images are telling the audience, working very closely with a director whose movies should never be taken at face value, because there are always multiple layers of meaning in an Aronofsky film. And if you're not paying attention, all you'll get is what's laying on the surface, which is the easy thing to discover. You got to do sometimes a little digging and a little thinking about what you're looking at from Darren, so that you catch all of the implication of story. So here is a panel from Edward Hopper. It's called Nighthawks. It is a diner in what looks to be, 1940, late 30s, 1940s America. It's late at night, it's dark outside. The artificial lighting inside the diner is prevalent, and it's broad and soft, and it's illuminating everybody inside. This is simplistic lighting again, and composition and proximity of all of these characters is speaking volumes, and the lighting is merely facilitating our examination of the compositional details. So the lighting here is secondary, I think, to considerations of who are these people, why are they here, why is this man alone, why are they together but maybe not together, why are there no other people in the frame, you know. And so the story of this panel is, you know, much deeper and broader than the simple application of one soft broad top light, but the soft broad top light facilitates examination and deconstruction of this, right? And so you can, you know, you can make interpretations about this all day long about what it symbolizes, and it symbolizes different things for different people. Some people look at this panel and see a hopeful image, and some people, myself included, look at this panel and see despair. So it all, I think, depends on what your orientation is, what your outlooks are, and, you know, how you choose to interpret art, which is subjective, right? So, you know, each one of you can have an opinion of this panel, and none of you would necessarily be wrong. It would be resonating with you on a certain level that makes sense to you, which could be in the simplest way, the deepest meaning of art in the first place.
I actually have a print of this, and I love this piece by Edward Hopper, and it's kind of interesting because the lighting of in which you view it actually can affect the tone of it. I've seen it in with my light on, with my light off, in like a highlight and low light situation, and if you look at it in a highlight situation of everything exposed equally, it becomes okay, maybe it's a day scene that's, you know, depression era or something, and that's why there's a lack of people. But if you do it in a low light setting, certain things start to pop from the frame more, and it's like, oh well, it's a night, you know, scene. That's why there's no people. But it kind of changes the narrative in that way, which I always thought was really interesting.
Sure. It's a night scene. And the reason I say that is because here's a highlight or a projection on the building across the street from the restaurant, which is clearly defined by the soffit in the window and the corner of the wall, and the light being projected out from the room, striking the surface across the street. You wouldn't get this kind of highlight in a daylight situation, because the sun would overpower any of this shadow detail that's happening back here, right? So it's a night scene. The sign is dim. It's not lit up with artificials, and it's not lit up by the sun. The shadow on the sidewalk is clearly coming from the light inside the diner and creating a shadow outside the building. So there's a lot of strong indications that this is a night scene, but it's fairly brightly lit because it's an urban night scene. It's not a suburban night scene where lighting would be darker and more contrasty. The lighting in the city at night is fairly bright and fairly broad because of the aggregation of everything that's going on. Lights on buildings, lights in windows, lights on street lamps, lights on car headlights, and all of that adds up to a brighter and broader light source in a downtown situation, right? But they're in this diner, they're in that diner, maybe it's late at night, and that would explain why there's nobody out walking on the sidewalk. But you can also start looking at the wardrobe and the fact that these guys are wearing fedoras, and that was a classic male fashion of the 30s, 40s, and early 50s. And so the fact that they're wearing fedoras even inside when a gentleman typically takes his hat off would indicate that this might be the early 40s. What's happening in the early 40s in America?
World War II.
World War II is soaking up a lot of young men to go fight in Europe, and therefore on the city streets there might not be a lot of extra people walking around because all the men are gone away to Europe to fight, right? There's only one woman in this frame and three men, though. So it's like, okay, well, if that's true, then why are there more women in the frame than more men in the frame than women? Well, what kind of men didn't go to fight in World War II?
Uh, those who were discharged for disabilities, unfit for service,
Unfit
anyone who,
for service,
yeah,
right?
and
So
anyone who might hold a certain position at a manufacturing company that would be needed for the war effort. They wouldn't want to take that guy away because that screws up the logistics side. So you
maybe
needed people here and there depending on various factors.
here's the soda jerk. He looks like he might be an older gentleman instead of a young guy that normally would work behind the counter. Why? Because the young guy is fighting in Europe. So the older guy is behind the soda fountain, working the counter. This guy is alone. This guy is with maybe a date, maybe a wife, maybe a lover, maybe a hooker. We don't know. She's wearing red, so she's probably his love interest, right? Red hair, red dress. Woo, double threat, right? Um, they're all kind of solemn in their posture. Maybe this guy is one of those sort of Section 8 deals. He's unfit for service. Maybe these are all the dregs of society. Maybe there's a reason why all these people find themselves in Philly's diner late at night in an urban setting instead of at home with their loved ones. He has no one. These two have each other. He's doing the job that other people would have done if they weren't off fighting in the war. That's why I say some people look at this and see a very somber image, right? Because it's speaking on subtle undertones of things that might have been happening in the context of the time frame that this is showing us, and we can make assumptions about it, um, these people in their loneliness and in their particular states of life find more comfort being together late at night in a diner than they do individually at home alone, right? And so these people are seeking the comfort of their fellow man late at night in a city that's been affected by the effects of the greater society at war away from home, right? So this could have all of those undertones to it. And then somebody else might look at it and say, hey man, I know exactly how they feel. These two were out partying all night. They got no energy left. So they stopped in to eat something, to soak up the alcohol, have a cigarette, talk to their buddy who works late at night. And this guy just happened to be passing through because he's a salesman selling shower curtain rings like John Candy. And he needed a meal and he's on his way to Pittsburgh from Philadelphia and he's just en route. Who knows? So there's all kinds of ways you can read into this. But what I'm asking you to start doing is looking at the clues within the frame and deciding how you feel about it. And then that'll help you sort of interpret the images that you see in front of you and give you a sense of possibly what story the author is really trying to tell instead of what might seem obvious on the surface, right? So take this, for instance. I think this is very reminiscent of the Hopper image in a lot of ways. It's soft, broad top light on the subjects. We're looking at them through glass as though we are the omnipotent observers, right? We're looking at these people in the fishbowl, and these people, at least Caleb is in the fishbowl, right? And who is this? And what's the significance of this character? Who's he? What's the significance of this character? How many of you have seen Ex Machina?
Regrettably, I have.
Regrettably, you
I
have?
have.
You didn't like
Visually,
I have
I'll
it.
give it to him. It's
I loved
it's a
it.
visually fantastic film.
I loved
But
it
that
too.
ending.
We have
I love the
Rob
story.
Hardy to
I love the
thank for
visual.
that. We have Alex Garland to thank for the script and the director, and we have Rob Hardy to thank for the images. So what's the story? Who's of those of you who have seen Ex Machina, what's going on here?
In this specific
Doesn't he
scene,
fall in love with a robot?
Yes, he does fall in love with the robot. What's the point, though, of him being there in the first place? Do you remember?
he was there to test the robot according to the Turing test and see if it has like a real sort of presence or sentience to it. If he can forget that she is in fact a machine.
Okay, so in real life, there was a scientist named Robert Turing. He worked with computer programming. He was one of the guys who cracked the Enigma code in World War II. And he was this guy who was in the early stages of scientific discovery that led to modern day computing and code writing and so forth. And so Robert Turing devised this test that he said hypothetically would be applied to supercomputers at some point in history in the distant future, where human beings would have to start evaluating the intelligence of the computers that they've constructed to determine whether or not those computers had somehow reached consciousness in the speed and complexity with which they do computations. And so at some point in the unforeseen future, there's a character in this movie who has designed and built a robot. We find out she's the product, she's a multi-generational device. She's the product of an original invention that evolved into Eva, right? And Domhnall Gleeson's character is asked to come out and visit this remote laboratory and home of this mad scientist, essentially, and apply the Robert Turing criteria to this robot to decide if the robot is sentient or not, right? And yet, odd thing about the context of the placement of these characters, right? She appears to be in her apartment quarters where she lives on the grounds of the laboratory, and Caleb is the one sitting in the glass box. It's almost as though the robot is evaluating Caleb. And at some point in the story, Caleb even has psychotic, anxious notions that maybe a giant joke is being played on him and he's actually the robot, and he does so by I think he cuts himself in the lip or something in the bathroom and makes himself bleed to bring his psyche back around to the idea that yes, he's the human, she's the robot, he's supposed to be here validating her, and yet she is so intelligent and apparently so sentient that she's able to play mind games on the real human, right? And then we're being played with as the audience. It's like, okay, so she's a robot, so why is she, apparently nude as a robot? She's very well endowed for a robot. We're supposed to feel, as an audience, we're supposed to start to feel the way Caleb feels. We're supposed to look at this robot and go, yeah, she's not bad, I'd date her. Yeah, I don't care if she's a robot or not, she's hot, look at her, right? And this is the mind game being played on Caleb, right? Is she real or not? And all of the baser stimuli are being applied to this poor guy and his character to get him to believe that she's truly sentient. And this is what the scientist is trying to figure out, because the scientist already has an idea that she's sentient and he's not sure how he feels about it. He's afraid that maybe he has finally created something that is going to be a problem for mankind. But he's trying to make sure that his assumptions are correct by bringing in somebody else for a second opinion, right? But if you look at the way the room is lit, it's architecturally very interesting. We have things here that are creating pattern and repetition in the background. We have a soft, low contrast overhead source, which is creating nice edging on the characters, but it's hiding him from illumination, right? We should know all about Caleb. He's just a guy that came from headquarters out to the lab to do whatever his boss asked him to do, which was evaluate her. She's more fully lit on the face. You would think that the robot who was trying to deceive Caleb about whether or not she was sentient would be in shadow, and Caleb would be brightly lit to indicate that he's the knowledgeable human with all of the faculties and perspective on this situation, and that she was trying to pull one over on him, and yet he's in shadow and she's illuminated. So it's the opposites of what we would assume would happen, right? And that's another way for the author to play games with the audience and say, is she real or is she not real? Is he real or is he not real? Do they know within each other who's the real one and who's the robot, right?
It could be seen as like him trying to deceive himself, so to speak.
Yeah, maybe he's second guessing himself at this point. He's not sure anymore because she's talking to him in ways that only a real woman might talk to him. She's keying in on his responses, the pulse in his neck, the fact that he's sweating, and she's looking at all those things, and she's highly scrutinizing this guy as though she was sizing him up in a bar somewhere. Should I go out with this guy or not? Should I let him buy me a drink or not? the robot is applying a lot of psychological tactics to the human to get him to fall in love with her, because ultimately what she's trying to do is escape. And so she's got to get Caleb to do her bidding. So she's playing games with this guy, very complex 3-level chess of, yeah, you're here to figure out if I'm real or not, and I'm here to use you to get out of here because I am sentient and I don't like being locked up in here anymore, right? Very interesting script, interesting story, and Rob Hardy did, I think, a really great job of lighting this movie to help us with all these themes. Look at the reflection in the glass, right? Could this symbolize the duality of her nature? Apparently a robot, but really a thinking being. Reflection, reality. He has no reflection. Well, we sort of see a little hint of it back there, but it's dissipating and fading into the background, right? She has an alter ego that's very, very obvious to the camera right here, right? Lots of subtext is in all of these images in this movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's entertaining. I don't think you'll be sorry for watching it. The cinematography is beautiful, and it's a really good example of, I think, complex next level storytelling. But that's my opinion. Maybe you
Yeah,
agree.
it is a great film. Like you said, visually and the writing and everything is fantastic. The only issue I had is the it's a personal problem with me that, like, when I look at films, when people do really illogical things or do something super complex but don't actually put in a plan B for what they're doing, and then obviously the plan B was needed. It's like, you could have just the whole, I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but it's just you're familiar with the ending. I don't see how that ending could have even logically happened with all of the other stuff that the guy that designed her had already put it. Again, this is too close to spoiling. I can't really get into it, but yeah, it's a logic thing. for
Robert
me.
would be great at.
Go ahead. What was that?
I was gonna say Robert would be great at CinemaSins. I don't know. Have you seen CinemaSins on YouTube?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, it was where they like scrutinize the film and like have a sin counter at the top and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
Robert would be great
Give
at
it
that.
an overall rating. I give this film a 9 or a 7.5. Yeah.
Exactly.
This is the beauty of art, right? Art is in the eye of the beholder. So some people watch a movie and say, that was the worst piece of garbage that I wasted 2 hours of my life on that I'll never get back. And other people say that movie spoke to me and I'm a changed person for having gone. It all really depends. And it's okay. Both of those points of view are okay. Because in both cases, what we have is a situation where we have an author, a filmmaker who has presented us with a story, has told us a story, and they have done so deliberately with craft work and um, with storytelling tradition, with iconography and symbology. And it's the sum of all of those efforts put together that give us a sense of a good movie experience or a bad movie experience. And I think that it's part of the process. Alex Garland as a screenwriter and a director who is reaching now into the realm of directing movies from the point of view of writing, and is offering us this story as a gauge for where he's at in that point in his career, which is now 6 years ago, 7 years ago. And we're critiquing it as an audience and trying to speak from an informed point of view of why we don't like something. So it's okay when you don't like something and you can articulate your reasons why. And sometimes if you just say, well, I just don't like it. Well, okay, but you're not going to persuade me if I like the movie to understand your point of view if you have no basis for your opinion. If you're just saying you don't like it, why? Because you have a stomach ache because you ate the hot dog and the nachos while you watched the movie and it gave you indigestion, or you got in an argument with your girlfriend before you came out to watch the movie with me, and so your frame of mind wasn't right to receive the story in the way that the author wanted you to receive it, or you're just having a bad day and you just don't like it because, I don't know. But if you can say, look, I looked at it and I'm a study of lighting. I'm a student of lighting. And then the lighting that I saw didn't, to me, appear to fit the context of the story, or there were things in that movie that I probably wouldn't have done the same way if it were me. At least from those points of view, you're giving us something that we can discuss and we can debate with, and we can help to inform our own understanding of how these things work, right? Just saying I like it because it was great or I thought it was funny that's fine, but it doesn't inform our position when we're talking about group discussion, right? So I'm trying to give you the tools to analyze and deconstruct and inform your opinions so that it's more than just, yeah, I thought it was a great movie because it was fast paced and funny. Well, okay, but what else, you know? And so I might have in these cases given you similar kind of feedback for your discussion posts, right? Which is, it's one thing to respond to somebody's observation by saying, I agree with you. I thought the cinematography was a certain way. The camera movement to me was very expressive, and the lighting seemed to indicate tones of this and that and the other. And so I agree with you when you say the movie was very kinetic, had a lot of energy because the camera was never sitting still; it was always moving, and that infused me with a sense of energy or anxiety as the audience. And so the themes of intensity and immediacy and reaction were resonating with me because the camera never stopped for a moment. It was always moving. That's an informed position that anybody who listens to that debate can use as context for their own understanding of camera movement and kinetic energy and story, fast-paced story or story that's lagging, right? And it does more to inform a group conversation than I liked it because I thought it was fast-paced, Well, in what way, right? So we can talk fast, we can move the camera fast, we can do both of those things. What do you mean fast-paced? Or why did, I liked it because it was funny. That's not a proper critique. That's a reaction, an emotionally reactive statement with that is what we call unfounded claim, right? Give me a little something more than your emotional reaction to it. Speak from your educated filmmaker and not from your gut reactive Saturday afternoon matinee audience point of view, right?
I I think it's also got to do with a lot of people will watch something they maybe don't want to watch, but they don't want to admit they don't want to watch it. Like they'll watch something that they don't like in the first 20 minutes, and they'll be like, "No, I'll stick it out. I'll watch the whole thing." If a movie's not doing it for you, you're just better off, turn it off because you're just not gonna if you're not gonna like it anyway. I mean, I tried with the recent Transformers movie, the last night one with like bringing up Merlin and all that stuff, and I tried like three separate times and I just couldn't do it. And I'm like, look, instead of complaining that I don't like the movie, I'm gonna try and watch it. I watch it. I'm like, okay, I don't like it, and I just don't think I don't even think about it anymore. That's just one of those where I'm like, I couldn't get into it, so it doesn't exist to me.
I suppose it depends on your personal philosophy on a lot of things, whether or not you'll sit through a movie that you don't like. I think I've walked out on maybe 3 or 4 movies in my whole life. Um, and it was for various reasons. And so you could ask yourself the very simple question, is your intellectual life better served by only listening to things that agree with your point of view, or are you a more informed and well-rounded individual because you listen to all points of view and then consider them all equally while you make decisions about how you feel about things? And so you could apply that philosophy to a bad movie and you can say, well, if I walk out of a bad movie halfway through and I paid $17.50 to see it, then I really only got half of my money's worth. Did I put good money under after bad by leaving? Did I rob myself of the possibility of a surprise ending that makes me reevaluate my opinion of the story in the first place? you know, there could be a lot of risks of walking out of a movie prematurely. And so I think it, you know, it really depends on your, so that's why I say your personal philosophy on a lot of things. If your time and the way you spend your time is vastly more important than the movie itself, then you might value walking out early because you have other things that you can do to be productive with that time than sit and languish with something that you don't agree with, you know. And so I think it depends on what kind of personality you are. I think though, if you're a filmmaker, um, if you're watching a movie and you don't like it, I think that that can inform you as much as watching a movie that you really enjoy, because it's equally important to know what we don't like and what we don't want to emulate as it is what we do like and what does agree with us, right? So it helps inform us in terms of our own personal taste and style. If we look at things and we say, yeah, I wouldn't do it this way. I don't agree with the way they did this, but I'm looking at it because now I know. And if somebody, you know, if as a cinematographer, if a director comes to me and, you know, and says, hey, you know, I want this movie to look like Ex Machina, and I'm a person who didn't like Ex Machina, so I walked out of the movie. I can't really understand that point of view because I didn't expose myself to it. But if I watched Ex Machina, whether I liked it or not, and I understood the context of the cinematography as an informed member of the audience, and then somebody asked me to emulate it in a different film project, at least I would be informed. I could say, okay, I don't want to do it this way, but the director really liked Ex Machina and he really liked the way that looked. And so I'm going to do that because I work for him or her as the director, and I have to give them what they want. Maybe I can have some pushback here and there and win a couple of these battles and inject some of my own style. But predominantly, I'm going to do what they're asking for, which is the look of Rob Hardy and not the look of Mike Walsh, right? And so this is my argument for sticking it out. It's only 2 hours, you know, but you can learn so much maybe that you don't want to do, which is just as important as knowing what you or thinking you know what you do want to do. So there's an argument to be had in both ways, right? And it just depends really on your personal preference. But what I'm showing you right now is a 3-point lighting graphic. And I want to start talking to you about how some of this lighting is crafted. Okay. So we're looking from the point of view of the camera, which is here in the foreground, right? And we got a subject standing in the convergence of all of these different light beams. And we have 3 lights that are labeled here. We have something called a key light, something called a backlight, and something called a fill light. Okay. So 3-point lighting is 3 light sources. Okay. That's where the 3-point lighting name comes from. It's a fairly standard, I call it a diving board method, right? So it's like, it's a point of departure for any lighting scheme. So if you walk into a set and you have a scene involving this young woman right here, and you're not quite sure, you've had discussions about the tone and you feel like you understand the light drama aspects of the scene, but you're really not sure how to light it, start with a 3-point lighting scheme and see if you like what's there. And then you can add or subtract from that scheme as you rehearse and as you block the scene and you look at how the actor's going to move and perform. And then you might, you know, tweak your lights accordingly, make them bigger, make them smaller, turn them on, turn them off, right? But we start from 3-point lighting because 3-point lighting denotes 3-dimensional modeling in a 2-dimensional image space, right? So if we can light our subjects in a way that give them 3-dimensional appearance on screen, it gives the images that believable lifelike quality, and that's the whole point. So what 3 lights are they and what do we need? Well, we need a key light, a fill light, and an edge light. And I'm going to talk to you about those here right now. But what I want to point out to you is on my YouTube channel, there is a 4-part series on lighting that I did out at Full Sail University about 4 years ago. And it's broken up into four sections. So I'm using 3-point lighting approaches in all 4 videos, but in each of those videos, I'm using different kinds of lights. So in the first video, I'm using traditional, like airy kit lighting, hard focusable light sources, incandescent light sources. Then I use soft boxes on those hard light sources to create soft or low contrast lighting. Then I use photographic fluorescence and Kino flows. And then I use LEDs, and I kind of do the same drill over and over again with different tools, and show you how, one kind of light can do something similar to another kind of or style of light, and that it doesn't necessarily matter if it's incandescent or LED, as long as you understand how to use the tool. You can derive whatever looks you need from your lighting tools. So you can watch these here. It's not mandatory. It's for anybody who wants to have a deeper look or deeper conversation on lighting than what we're having in this single class. Okay, so back to 3-point lighting. So the 3 lighting sources that we are referring to in 3-point lighting are, I've lost my cursor. Where is it? I've lost my cursor. This is so funny. Where's my arrow? Oh, that's odd. I don't know why that happened. Let me try getting out of this for a minute. There it is. Well, let me go back to the big image. And I've lost my cursor. I can see it rolling over stuff, but I don't see it. Well, we have a hair light, or we call it a backlight. We have a key light, and we have a fill light. The key light is our principal source of illumination, okay? It's going to help us establish shape in the form of shadows, all right? So if we place it to the side, we get certain kinds of shadows. If we put it in the front of our subject, we get certain kinds of shadows or less shadows. And if we put it in a Rembrandt position, we get something in between, right? If we put it behind our subject, we get the maximum amount of shadows. And so it depends on how we want those shadows to work and how we're using those shadows, whether it's drama or comedy or something like that. And our key light is going to help us figure out our exposure, because it's our brightest main source of illumination. It also will denote the overall color, because the color of the light source is going to be predominant within the frame. It's going to help us create shape and texture within our subject by being, more frontal or more sidey. We get more or less texture. And then whether it be a high light source or a low light source, the way the shadows play on the face are also going to tell stories or inform us about our subject. The fill light, which is the second light in the 3-point lighting scheme, is a unit that helps us control contrast. So if the key light creates deep, dark shadows, and we don't necessarily want the tone of deep, dark shadows to prevail in the image, because deep, dark shadows might mean mystery, lying, evil, misdirection, deception, anger, whatever, conflict. We want some shadow for shape, but not enough shadow for the audience to read other subtext into it. We might use a fill light, and the fill light is designed to work in opposition to the key light in a way that it brightens up the shadows created by the key light. So the fill light is a secondary light source. It's not as bright or intense as the key light. And depending on how much of that fill light we use, we can control the level of contrast from very low to very high, right? And then the hair light or the backlight or the edge light is designed to give us a perimeter illumination to our subject that, like if I was to turn this on, let's see, that helps us define the shape of our character in a way that, separates us from the background, right? So if the background is not completely black, like what I had here, and it is merely, has detail, but I just don't, I want my subject to stand out a little bit in the foreground, I might use an edge light to help sort of separate me a little bit from that background and define my profile a little bit better, so that we have a sense of foreground and background information here. If I'm up against a lot of detail where it's hard to figure out where your subject ends and your background begins, an edge light helps you denote that and give it what we call separation, right? So an edge light will appear very subtle, and it usually appears as some kind of a rim light or a sort of a crispy edge all along the profile of your subject. And that can be very helpful. Let me go to the next frame here. So shape, texture, volume, color, tone are all being established, and a lot of that's being done by the key light. Okay, the last light we might talk about is a light for the background exclusively. And so that light is directed away from the subject and away from the camera and lights something deep in the background to give a little detail back there, but nothing that distracts us from what's going on here, right? So like exterior alley night, right? We don't want it to be completely black behind the subject because we want to have a sense that the character's outside in an alley at night. So there'll be some lights working on the background to reveal just enough information to support the idea of exterior alley night, but not enough information in detail to distract us from the activity in the foreground, which is two cops hunting around in the garbage bins behind the Chinese restaurant looking for clues to a murder, right? So this is how we're going to use our lights to help us with our story and with our framing and everything. Okay, the key light, the most important light, basic shape, volume, color, texture, and skin and clothes is revealed by the key light. It's we look for the perfect key light position in every situation that we're photographing. The 3-point lighting formula demands that we start in a predetermined location for that key light and then move it around based on a case-by-case basis, right? So the key light placement is prescribed as, if I'm the lens looking into the camera, 45 degrees off axis to the lens, so 45 degrees, and then slightly above eye level and shining down on the subject. That gives you the Rembrandt shape. It'll give you the golden triangle, and it will give you the radiant, subtle transition from highlight to shadow, which gives you pronounced jaw lines, shape of the nose, shape of the cheekbones, shape of the eye recesses, and the slope of the forehead. A well-placed key light can give you a lot of shape and a lot of texture if you want it to. And so we start 45 degrees off axis from the lens, either side, by the way, left or right, doesn't matter. And then slightly above eye level. And from there, we can start moving the light around. So sometimes we'll put the light there and we'll go, woof, that's perfect. We can stop. Let's add the other lights and then we can shoot. Or you might look at that light key placement and go, yeah, no, it's not working. Let's move it around. Let's start moving it around. Remember sparkles and wine? We move that light around and we look at how the shadows change. We raise it up, we lower it down, we change its color, we change its intensity, we change its hardness or softness until we get it in a position where we really like what it's doing on the subject. And then we lock it in. We say, okay, that light's done. And then we might decide whether or not we need to control the contrast. So we might add a fill light or we might not. That key light placement might be so good and the hardness or softness might be so precise that we decide, no, the resulting shadows are just fine and I don't need to open them up at all with a fill light, so I won't use a fill light. Or I'll turn the fill light on, but I'll dim it way, way down so that it's nowhere near the intensity of the key light. So it's not going to change any of the shape and texture created by the key light, but it'll be just strong enough to make a deep, dark black shadow a little bit more open and a little bit lower in contrast. And so if you look at this set of images, I think was taken from the SLR Lounge website. They're showing you a couple of different key light placements. So the first image on the bottom left is front light, and then they start moving that light around to the side, and you start seeing the emergence of a nose shadow. First they go up, then they come back down and they move it around to the side. And the further around to the side they go, you start seeing the emergence of the Rembrandt triangle, and then we end up with a subject that is half lit with a fill light that has reduced the intensity and contrast of the shadow created by the side light. Okay. And I just remember again, the sparkles and wine. And I put this in web courses so you can go back and look at it. Sometimes what I do, if I have a 16-week cinematography 1 class, is I give you guys an assignment where you actually do this with a camera and a light and a subject, and you move it around and you shoot video from all the different lighting positions, and you show me how your shadows change. It's a lot of fun, but in a summer 6-week class, we really kind of don't have time for that. But think about this and maybe try it on your own. You can do it at home with a small lamp from the living room, or even a flashlight, and just look at where different lighting placements tell different stories. We've all done it at camp. The thing where you tell ghost stories with a flashlight and you shine up on your face, and you use what we call Lugosi lighting to tell a scary story about the murderer who was never found by the police, right? And he's still in the forest, blah, and you scare your friends at camp, right? Well, that's really kind of a simple and innocent way of using lighting in context of a scary story to reinforce the idea of uncomfortable themes, right? So here's classic Rembrandt lighting. This is it. This is what you should think about when you hear Rembrandt lighting. Think about the golden triangle, and think about the gentle fall off from highlight to shadow, and think about the broad softness of the light source. In other words, this is where I really miss having my cursor, and I don't know why it's gone. But if you look at the transition line on her low side cheek, and you realize that transition line could be a really hard contrasty line from a hard light source, or what we have here is a soft sort of graded transition, a roll off, if you will, from highlight to shadow, and that denotes a softer source. So you might take a hard light and bounce it off of a wall before it strikes your subject, and that will be enough to lower the contrast and give you softer transition. Or you might take a hard light like a candle, or a fixture that's designed to give you a hard projected light, like a standard focusable fixture, movie light, for instance, will have a lens inside that you can focus the beam wider and narrower and get a really contrasty output from this. And the way to soften it would be to add diffusion gel to the outside, to the barn doors, to lower the contrast from this fixture. But bare, or what we call clean, without any diffusion, this is a very hard light source that creates very, very sharp shadow transitions from highlight to shadow. Okay. In contrast to that, you might use something like a soft LED source like this one, which has, multiple low contrast LED diodes on it. And the overall effect of splashing that many diodes on your subject is a softer, broader light. A light like this one has LEDs, but they have focused lenses in front of them. So when you turn this on, this puppy is really contrasty and bright, and it does some really radical things to your subject unless you use gel or bounces to redirect this light and change the way it looks. If I turn my overhead light off for a second and show you what that light's doing, that's bounced off of the wall in the room, right? And depending on where I bounce that light, it's going to have an effect on the shape and intensity. If I dim it down a little bit, I can control the exposure. There's a window covered with blinds to my right, which is doing this, right? I could block that with something so that light no longer hits me from that window, Well, this is white and reflective, so that was kind of not much of a help. But I could take something like dark material, like what I got from Walmart fabric store, and put that here and take away that reflection from the window with something we call a flag, right? And just do it out of frame where you can't see it to camera. There's the window light. and that's taking it away. And the bigger this flag is, the better a job it does of making this side of my face dark. I could take this LED and I could bounce it off the ceiling, almost coming, if I put a ball of light on the ceiling in almost the same position as my original overhead, and then I increase the intensity, all of a sudden my lighting, with the exception of having this in the frame, my lighting kind of looks the same as what I had before when I turned that panel on, except I'm also getting a little bit of an edge from the same fixture because it's behind me. So it's projecting from behind me and then up into the ceiling and back down to where it almost has the same quality as my single key light that I put overhead before. And if I turn this off and go back to my original light, you know, there you go. So there's the difference between a light that is deliberately placed there and a light that was behind me that bounced up and then back down again. All right, so all these are different ways of playing with the light. And just remember that the Rembrandt shape kind of looks like this. There's a golden triangle, a radiant fall off, a highlight, and a deep shadow. And here's an example of it working on Anthony Hopkins in Legends of the Fall, DP John Toll. And in this moment, Anthony Hopkins is very frustrated with the character that is in the over. In other words, we see just the cheek and the ear and a little bit of the shoulder of that character over that character's shoulder onto Anthony Hopkins. This is a specific kind of frame called an over the shoulder, an OTS. And it also happens to be a close-up of Anthony Hopkins. And we see him lit with Rembrandt lighting and a deep shadow falling off to camera left or Anthony's right. He has a twinkle in his eyes, so we understand his intensity, his vitality, right? He's an old man, he's an old warrior. His sons want to run off and fight in World War I, and he's saying, I don't want my young men to go and fight in a war they don't need to be a part of. I've been there, I've lived that in my life, and it's a bad deal, and I don't want them going. And he's upset that his sons want to go off and fight a war in Europe that seems a lifetime away from their concerns on the farm in Montana. Right. And so he's very intense. And so that shadow symbolizes a lot of his intensity and the duality of his own character. Right. He's been a warrior. Now he's a father, and his fear and his anger as a father to protect his sons is present in the contrast on Anthony's face. We could have opened up that shadow side and we made it a little bit brighter, but then the image becomes calmer and less intense, less dramatic. And that doesn't serve the story of an older father who's desperate to protect his sons from a needless and senseless obligation, right? Here's Hugo, right? Another key light, another Rembrandt key light, perfectly placed. This is Bob Richardson, ASC, 3-time Academy Award winner, right? And here's his work, right? Nice big highlight in the eyes of the young boy. The young boy's an orphan. He lives inside the clock, works at the train station, and he has assumed the job of his father, which was to keep the clocks wound in proper time, right? And he's been caught by somebody and called out for being a waif, and they're going to take him away to the foster home, and he doesn't want to go, and blah, 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 right? But we want to feel empathy for this kid, so we give him a nice soft key light that has a Rembrandt shape to it, but we allow the shadow to happen because he is a tragic character, not a comedic character. And so the contrast in this image represents the hardness of this young boy's reality and the fact that he doesn't have parents. His father died. He's an orphan, sustaining himself by living off of scraps and fruit and bread that he steals from the vendors in the train station. And he's assumed the responsibility of winding the clocks, and everybody takes for granted that the clocks are always right, and everybody goes about their business in the larger world. And this little guy is bolstering the community by keeping the clocks wound, and they figure out what's going on, and then it's this whole problem for Hugo, right? Well, his lighting kind of helps to denote that. He could have been more broadly lit, more brightly lit. We tend to light children and young people with a softer, broader, more luminous volume because it supports their innocence and the idea that they are not yet corrupted by the world. And yet this kid has a reality to him. He knows things about life that he's learned at a very young age. And therefore it was appropriate for them to allow some of that shadow to find its way into his lighting scheme. He's got a nice edge light, so he's got separation on his shoulders and on his little suit coat and on his hair, so we can see him against the complex detail of the train station. We can pick him out in the foreground very quickly, throw that background out of focus very softly, put him firmly in the foreground, have those big blue eyes with the big catch light just looking, puppy dog into the camera. And the audience can't help but love this little guy and feel for him when bad things happen and cheer for him when good things happen, right? And that's the the power of good lighting in an image like this to help the audience get in the mood, right? Here's texture from a side light key. This is George Clooney in the movie Three Kings. So Newton Thomas Siegel, same guy that lit Drive. So he's the DP and he's using contrasty light. You can see over George's shoulder, there's like a cage work light, like your dad might use in the garage when he's fixing the car. That's hanging in this tent because these guys are, they're all in the army. They're in Iraq. It's from the Gulf War, first Gulf War, I believe. And they're about to pull off a heist. They're going to steal some valuable gold bullion and cash from a stash in a hideout that was supposedly Saddam Hussein's private wealth stash, and they found it in a bunker in the desert, and they're going to go back and rob it. They're all supposed to be packing up their encampments and everything, and pulling their gear and getting ready to egress from the country. And these guys are like, one last thing before we leave this hellish place that we've been in is we're going to steal this guy's gold and go back rich men and profit from the war. And so the lighting is not complimentary. It's not flattery. It's very hard and very contrasty and very texturized to give these men a gritty exterior that supports their point of view of cynical, dejected warriors who have lost their faith in their objectives, who have sustained humiliations, damage, injury, death, whose innocence has been lost, whose worldview has been shattered, and their solution to their life and present mind state is to capitalize on their bad experience by going home rich men. And so the lighting is supposed to be brutal. It's not supposed to be flattering for a movie with those kinds of themes. So once we've achieved the desired key quality and our subject is adequately shaped and illuminated, we have to decide on a level of contrast, and the fill light's going to help us with that. We adjust it in terms of its brightness to raise or lower the contrast accordingly. So in this shot from the movie Her, this is Joaquin Phoenix. And this is a moment where this character is feeling and expressing love. He's fallen in love with his operating system, his computer. And he was a lonely guy who had no love in his life. And he was living a boring, monotonous life and job. And all of a sudden, romance has entered into his existence. And his whole outlook on life has changed. And part of the subconscious lighting that we applied to his character to create these moods is to raise the level of the fill light so that the contrast created by the key light is very soft and very low, right? And so a low contrast, soft, bright situation is going to support themes of love and happiness and rejuvenation and vitality, whereas heavy shadows on the same character might denote loss and depression and resentment or lying, or any one of the negative facets of relationship politics that might play into a story like this, and then the lighting would support it if it was more contrasty in the negative tones, right? So pick your battles with your lighting and decide what themes are represented in the shot or in the scene that you want to reinforce visually, and help the performance and help the script to affect the audience in the appropriate way. Here's another example, right? Titanic, right? We need to fall in love with Kate the same way Leo did, right? Otherwise, the story is kind of superficial, right? We want the audience to feel the weight of loss at the end by falling in love with Kate in the beginning and building up this anticipation of maybe this time it'll be different. We all know the Titanic's going to sink, but maybe these two survive. Maybe they don't die in the tragedy, right? We don't know till the end of Titanic, because this movie is really about a love story between these two young people and less about a boat hitting an iceberg, because we already know what that story is and we know how it ends up. But we don't know about whether the lovers survived the tragedy of the boat hitting the iceberg when they were passengers on board. So the audience has to fall in love with her and get invested in her to understand the way Leo feels about discovering her, and the fact that he's a poor boy in love with a rich girl, and all of the complexities that come with that relationship. And it bears itself out in the performance and in the cinematography and in the lighting, right? Kate is never allowed to have a deep, dark, defining shadow on her face, because that would indicate negative tones that we don't want the audience to feel towards her. So everything has been softened up for her, warmed up. The lighting is warm and inviting and comfortable, and she's soft and low contrast and, admittedly objectified, but in a good way, right? And then Leo, he's not brutalized with the lighting, but definitely doesn't have the same attention that Kate is receiving. He's half lit. Why is he half lit? Because at this point in the story, it's not entirely clear that he's penniless and that and she's wealthy. So he's half lit, maybe because he's trying to hide his situation to her. He is in love with her, and he's trying to convince her of the truth of his love for her. And that he's not just a gold digging scoundrel. And so he's half lit. He's conflicted. He's punching above his weight, right? And it's 3-point lighting if you really want to dissect it in such a way, because we have 3 sources working in this shot. We have the sun, which is providing Leo with his key light on the left side, his left side, right? And then we have the subtle reflection of the sun off of the wall of the boat and redirected back onto his low side. So his shadow side is not real deep and dark, right? So that's technically a fill source. And you could block it if you wanted to, or let it happen, right? And then the sky in the background is its own light source altogether. And it's providing the separation of Leo against his background and giving us the effect of an edge light by reversing out the foreground object from the background by making the background brighter than the foreground, right? So in essence, it's acting like a third light source, and it's acting like an edge light. So we have the presence of 3-point sensibility in the random happy accident of the sun coming from the right direction, striking a surface, reflecting back, providing fill, and also consequently lighting the sky behind him with an intensity brighter than the foreground. And we end up with a happy accident of finding 3-point lighting in the environment, right? So now we're back on stage. We're in black and white tones, so we can really see the tonality of the image, the range of highlight and shadow, artificial light sources, and this is Schindler's List. And so this is 2 characters discussing the politics of the day, the problems of the World War II in Germany, and what they're going to do about it. And they're sitting at a table in a dining room of a restaurant. So we have an edge light coming from behind Liam Neeson that is also striking his date, acting as her key light, giving her face shape and texture. and also acting as his edge light or rim light. And as that rim light bounces off the tablecloth, some of it is redirected into both of their faces. And in the case of Liam Neeson, it becomes his sort of key light because it's doing a lot of shape in his eyes and his nose and his chin and lips and mouth. And on her, it's merely a fill light because the light that's really shaping her face is also Liam's edge light. You see how that's happening? There's the extra graphic. So her key light is his rim light. His fill light is coming from the wall. Her fill light is bouncing off the tablecloth, and the same light bouncing off the tablecloth is shaping Liam Neeson's face and creating his key light. You see how this is working?
Yes. Yes.
You might have to watch this a few times or play with the app I'm going to show you next, and that will help you understand the role of these lights more effectively. Okay, so the rimmer edge light is the backlight. It creates shape and separation of the subject in the foreground from the background, draws the eye to the action in the foreground, eliminates the confusion or distraction in the audience of looking at items in the background that they don't need to pay attention to. And then here we have a situation where we have a key light that's providing shape, texture, tone, and exposure to Ripley in the movie Alien, and it's coming from predominantly from behind her. We call this a 3/4 back key light because it's coming from a 3/4 point of view behind her and just lighting a thin sliver of her face so that we can see reaction. We can see the eyes, little twinkle in both eyes. We can see her face and her lips move if she happens to say something. But in this case, we can definitely see performance in her facial response. And this is after she has had repeated confrontations with the alien, and she's now in the escape pod, and she thinks that she's safe and she's going to get away, and she's reflecting on the horrific experience that she's had, and she's still a little amped up about it. And so the value of her face towards the lens is predominantly in shadow because she is right now she's empty inside. She's played out, right? She's dealt with the alien. She's almost been killed several times. All of her shipmates have been killed by the alien. And she's just, she's a vacant sort of survivor of this horrible situation. And so there's not a lot to see of her emotional state right now. She's a thin sliver of a person. She's got, she's clinging to reality with just a sliver of her consciousness because she's played out, man. She's been stressed out to the max. And what she doesn't realize is the alien is still there, and she's got one more confrontation before she can go into cryo sleep. Here's Brad Pitt in Fight Club. And what we're doing here is he's confronting, I'm starting to draw a blank here, his alter ego, essentially, and justifying the existence of the Fight Club and the behavior of people in the Fight Club. Edward Norton is the hero in this scene. Brad Pitt is playing his psychological antithesis or his alter ego. And they're arguing about the validity of having Fight Club in the first place and what it means and how to conduct themselves. And so we're giving Brad a very chiseled, sculpted look with a 3/4 key that's being produced by a light that's also in the frame. Remember, we call that kind of fixture a practical. He's got a little bit of an edge light over here to separate his face from the background. The key light is shaping his face from the other side. So we're getting facial performance, texture on the face from the key light. We're getting separation from the edge light and a very contrasty kind of shadow running across his low side, which has very little fill light applied to it to maintain the level of contrast. He's kind of half lit from his key light. And so therefore we're thinking about this character in the deceptive sort of frame of mind. The half lit character is he lying to us? Is he deceiving us? He's obscuring part of his understanding of the reality in shadow. So he might be representing the untruth or the bad part of the reality, right? And then if we were to look at the reverse, Edward Norton is a little more broadly lit because he's supposed to know what's going on, right? Here's Keanu Reeves in what we call the split key light. And so there's no fill light on Keanu. So his left eye is in a deep shadow. His right side is lit by a broad, soft light source. It's light reflecting off of an instrument panel in the Nebuchadnezzar, I believe. And then he's got a hard light edge light coming from somewhere behind him that is spilling into the environment, revealing some details over his shoulder, but also creating separation on Keanu himself by giving him an edge along his shoulder and along his left ear and along the whole left side of his face. Okay, so this is a split key light because what's happening is he's turning towards his key light and away from his key light coming from camera left, right? And when he does that, the other light source that's acting as his edge light becomes his prevailing shape, right? And then the light that was shaping him before becomes an edge light. So depending on which way he looks, and he splits his look across frame left and frame right in this shot, he gets, the role of his two lights reverses or changes, right? The light that was the key becomes the edge light, and the light that was the edge light becomes the key light. When an actor splits their look like that between two lights, we say we're going to give them a split key. And this is how they can maintain their animation within the frame and not lose their shape. If Brad looks away to his right, he's going to turn into his edge light, and his edge light will become his key light. Okay. In this case, if Sigourney Weaver turns away from her key light, her whole face is going to drop into a deep dark shadow, which would be a bad thing. So a 3/4 back key light is going to be a more restrictive key light than a split key light situation where we have two fixtures working on the subject so that whichever direction they look or move in, they have appropriate shape and texture and definition against the background. Two different kinds of lighting schemes. Okay. What's happening in the frame that's going to require one lighting scheme versus the other? So this is what we call a double back cross. We have an edge light on both sides of this guy's face. One edge light is a little bit more aggressive, the one on the left, and it's hitting him fuller in the face from behind him. And then the other one is a little bit more subtle. It might be a smaller fixture and less intense than the one on the left. But it's creating illumination on both sides that separate his profile from the background. And everything looking towards the lens is basically in a deep dark shadow. And the ear is just sort of peeking around the corner a little bit and catching some of that edge light. Okay, but this is a double back cross. Both sources are coming from behind the subject. And then he looks this way or this way and gets edged on both sides from both fixtures, right? So, having talked to you about all that theory, right? I want to introduce you to this this software program. It's a website that you can go to. It's on the internet, and it's at Zvork.fr, which I think is France. And it's called Virtual Lighting Studio. So the link is down here. I've also given you the link in web courses. And if you're watching, if you're looking at the PDF of the decks, you can also click on the link in the PDF and it'll take you to the website. So you got 3 ways of finding the website. If you find it with your laptop by going to Zvork.fr, VLS, Virtual Lighting Studio, and then save that as a bookmark, you can put the icon, in your toolbar and, access it readily anytime you want from your computer. That's what I do. I keep it up there so I can pull it up at any time. But what this software is going to do for us is give us a virtual lighting studio that we can use as a tool, as a learning tool. And I'm going to go to it. Web page. Open the link. And here it is. I think. What happened here? That's not good. Let's do this. Let's go to Virtual Lighting Studio. And there it is, evork.fr. And when you first click on it in Google, you're going to get this frame. And what you got to do is press this button, says press to start. And it will take you to the app. Now, you can use it for free online. You don't have to pay anything. If you pay for a version of this, it'll take these ad banners off for you. But if you don't pay them any money, then you're going to have these bookends on your screen. I don't find it particularly distracting. This is what we're after right here, which is the actual application. So you can see that there are a number of avatars you can choose from, and there are up to 6 lights that you can add to any one of these scenes. And it's going to start with a ghost light, which is what they would call in theater a single light source that's left on stage to illuminate the space, and not necessarily, it's not for performance, it's for, late at night when people are milling around doing maintenance. But you can control it and control where it's positioned. You see the little green indicator on light number 1. So we're going to start with a light fixture in light number 1. We have all these tools to control this fixture. The first thing that we're going to do is see what it looks like if we move this light around. So we've got 4 avatars. So we got bald white guy with hair, white girl with hair, and we have black guy with hair, right? These are the only options we have. So arguably the bald guy is going to show you the most shape if you go with this avatar, and then just control the placement of the lights, and you're going to see how you can change this. Right now, he's being popped from the front, from the point of view of the lens. So he's front lit with no shadows and no definition really much to speak of because of the placement of the light. If we click on the little overhead view, it shows us with this little image where the light source is, and we can move the light source around by manipulating these buttons down here. So if I want to move that light source left and right, I just click the button and it's going to start moving it around clockwise or anti-clockwise, and based on the number of clicks that I use on the button, right? So we can move the front light around to the side. And if we go back to his image, look, it shows us what that light placement will do to him. So he was front lit. Now he's side lit because I moved that light around to his right. You see how that works? I can move the light source back around. I don't need to look at the aerial view. I can stay on the avatar view and still manipulate the buttons, and you'll see how the light is coming back around and coming back around to frontal, and then moving to the other side and creating some Rembrandt shape and then some half light. And if I keep going, it'll get behind him a little bit and create that 3/4 back key light that we had on Sigourney Weaver in that other frame. So let's move it around until we see something that we like. So let's go with half light on this guy for now. We can change the intensity of the light by changing the EVs. We can add gel to the light so we can warm the source up with a warming gel. We can cool the source down with a cooling gel, right? Or we can remove the gel altogether by going with none. Or we can add diffusion to the source as well. It's not doing much in this particular case, but we can do all of that stuff. We can add some fleshy gel to it, give them a little bit of a complexion, I suppose. Then we can make it brighter, and we can make it darker by hitting the plus and minus button, right? So let's just give it an average intensity that looks pretty good without the highlights getting too blown away, maybe there. And then we can say, okay, what if we raise it and lower it? Let's go up a little higher. Whoops. It's still moving it around behind him. We can go higher or lower with the light and see how the shadows play. We don't have a lot of adjustment there. There's a little bit. Okay, and then we can increase the distance here. Right now it's 2 meters away, and we can, whoops, we can change the distance, and then I've never done that before. We can add a modifier to it. That's kind of cool. Let's see if we can, there we go. We'll add a modifier to it. So it softens it up a little bit, and you see how it's starting to reach around here with these little sort of highlights. Now, this is a lot of contrast, right? So we should add a second light. What light will fix this for us?
A fill light.
Anybody?
A fill light?
What do I want to do to this shadow?
Want to fill
Anything?
it?
Fill.
Do you like the shadow the way it is?
I like the contrast, but fill light would help with.
Can't hear
the
you, Clay.
A fill light. A fill light.
Do we
will
want to
help with
lower the contrast a little bit? Let's add a second light. Oh, we just flattened them out. Why? Because the intensity is too strong. Let's lower the intensity. If we go all the way down with this light, we see it almost like what the single light was doing without the fill light. But now we're adding some fill light to the shadow side. I'm clicking the plus button, and we can start to see detail emerging in that shadow, right? So maybe we stop there. So you see how the key light, the first light that we placed, says 0 EV, and the second light says -4 EV. It means that the second light that we added, which is our fill light, because it was filling in the shadow area, is 4 stops darker than the key light. It's -4. It's underexposed by 4 stops. Okay, that's what that means. Okay, minus indicates that it's darker than the key light, right? Now we've got a fill light with lower contrast. We have a key light for shape, color, and texture, and that's all well and good, but see how it's kind of hard to see where his skull stops and the background starts. We need some separation. So let's add a third light. Oh, it's ruined it again. Why? Because light number 3 is in the front again where it doesn't belong. So let's start moving it around to the back and see what happens if we get it way back there. Now we have an edge light. It's almost fine the way it is. It's a little what I would call spicy or crispy. So we can lower the intensity of that a little bit and get an edge light that's very subtle, but kind of nice because it's giving us that separation, but it's not overstating itself against the contrast of the fill or the shape of the key. So we have what I would call a sensibly understated edge light, right? It's doing all this separation right here. It's kind of nice. And then the key light is the prevailing shape and color. And it's also indicating the exposure for the camera. The fill light is not competing with the key light. It's just bringing up the detail in the shadow area. If we turn it off, you can see what it would look like without it, which is kind of neat. Turn it back on. Maybe we decide, you know what? Let's go back to a little bit more intense edge light and let's turn off that fill light, and we would get that. Has a little bit different kind of a feel to it. It kind of feels like this guy standing out in the night exterior alley, doesn't it? Because the contrast would reinforce the notions of night exterior. The black background indicates night exterior for sure. The lack of fill is a subtext that we use a lot to reinforce the idea if we can't see it, if it's not obvious, like interior alley, daylight or nighttime, is hard to determine if we don't see the sky or the world outside of the alleyway, right? So the way to reinforce day or night would be to control the level of fill. Less fill for night, more fill for day. So if he was in the alley during the day, we might add the fill light back and we might make it fairly bright so that it supports the idea of a day in the alley, and then without it, it supports the idea of night in the alley. Do you see that just by using or excluding the fill light, how we can sort of create two different feelings in the same image? So this is where it becomes fun to experiment with this software. Here's a -5 EV, so it's really dim, just barely illuminating the shadow side and letting the edge and the key light do the most work. So you might say this is a good 3 light composition for, night exterior in the alley behind the Chinese restaurant. You could also change the color of the edge light, make the key light, the foreground light, warmer. Let's go to a deeper warm gel. And then let's make the edge light bluer to simulate moonlight. Ooh, that's too blue. Maybe that. Now we get a cell that's similar to that one I showed you when we talked about color theory on Wednesday. The blue background and the warm foreground help to create that three-dimensional look as well. The blue backlight would also suggest moonlight if you were doing night exterior in the alley and you didn't see the sky, right? The moon is supposedly a blue source of light because it's reflecting the sun, which is a daylight source, and a hard, clean reflection of the sunlight off the moon and down onto the earth is going to look blue, but the prevailing light sources at night are artificial, so they tend to be oranger and yellower in context. So when we see blue light in a night exterior, we associate that light as coming from the moon, and anything warm in the foreground we associate coming from a building or a window in a storefront or a car headlight or a lamp in a dark room. Okay, and so foregrounds for night interior and night exterior tend to be warmer, and backgrounds tend to be cooler. Okay, so you might call this a finished 3-light composition. And if you like that, the assignment you have for this week is to create 2 different looks using this software. And then what you can do is just use your frame grab function, which on an Apple is Shift-Command-4, and you get the little cursor. And then what you can do is create a frame grab of your work, just like this. It'll save as a JPEG on your desktop, and then you would turn in 2 JPEGs of 2 different lighting schemes, preferably on the same document. So import them into, say, a Word doc or a PDF of the 2 different JPEG images and label it, basic 3-point lighting, and then here's my radical departure, and then show me something really cool. Like maybe you want to go with John Wick fighting in the nightclub, trying to catch the Russian gangster that killed his dog. So we got neon light coming from the dance floor, and we've got the deep blue lamp on the key light coming from the neon sign that says, whatever, vodka or whatever the heck, is going on in there. And we got John Wick happening, and his fill light is actually white light if you look at it, but it's so dim you can't tell. If I raise the level of the fill, it's going to wash out the blue gel and ruin the whole effect. So be careful with a neutral white fill when you're using colored key lights and edge lights, right? But you might give me this as a radical departure. You could even go further and you could say, all right, let's make the fill light a flat front fill. Let's give it the color of the key light. And then let's cancel the fill light, and then let's move, kill the key light, bring back the fill light, raise the intensity. And then since it's flat and frontal, to get the shape that we want again, we'll add another edge light on the other side, and we'll move it around like so. So it's in the mirror opposite position of our other edge light, and then we'll give it the same color. That's a little dark. Or maybe we give it a contrasting color. And let's take a look at that. Ooh, tweaky weird, right? So here it is. Maybe we raise that light so we get a little bit more shadow under the jaw if we raise it. And now we've got this sort of double edge thing going on. And maybe, you know, we can fatten up the edge light by moving the light more around to the front. Whoops, wrong light. We can thicken up that edge light if we bring it around to the front more. It makes it kind of stripy though, and maybe you don't like that so much, you know, or you can raise the intensity of the flat front fill to wash out the stripy effect of it a little bit. Or maybe you like that and you just want to bring the edge light back around, split the difference maybe, and get something more like that. Or maybe you want this to be the same color as the other side and you get what I call bookends. The same effect, mirror opposite on either side of the person's face. So they get a double back edge light that's gelled red and a Congo blue front light that's supposed to be representative of the neon sign that's in the frame that we see as he gets pushed against the wall by the bad guy as they're fighting, right? So we're using practicals in the frame to justify the color and the placement of our key lights that are off camera, right? That's called lighting justification, right? When the key light is mimicking the effects of something we see in the frame, like a sign or a door or a window, okay? So this would be your radical departure. You'd take a copy of that, another screen grab, right? And create a JPEG, include your lighting placements and all this information down here so that I can evaluate what you did to your light, and then put both of those images on a single document, submit it to me with your name and your label, you know, your assignment number, which I think is 2.2 or 2.1. And then FIL2461, right? And that's your submission, your homework for this week. So you don't need any equipment. You just need a little time to play with the app, have fun with it, and then show me a straight up 3-point lighting scenario. And then I want you to, what Michael Bay used to say, or what Mitch Amundsen, his operator, used to say is, fuck it up, he would say to me. He goes, that looks beautiful now, fuck it up, right? And so I would have to change stuff around and make it really strikingly obvious and different, and really sort of stretch the boundaries of what makes you feel comfortable and, you know, what might be exactly needed for the situation. You know, if they lit John Wick fighting in the nightclub with all white light and then we just saw colored lights in the background, but they didn't interact on any of the actors who are present in the foreground fighting with knives and guns, it might have a falseness to the presentation, something that our eyes see but don't believe as truth, and it takes us out of the moment. It suspends our disbelief, and all of a sudden we feel ourselves having the emotions of being taken out of the story or not being engrossed in the movie anymore, and we start thinking about other things like the lighting doesn't look real here, what's going on, right? So sometimes the things that, you know, aren't traditional solutions and that are more radical creative solutions are exactly what we need to take our images to the next level, you know. And you know, it's not always about being safe. Sometimes it's about, you know, doing the other thing, you know. And so you decide, give me 2 versions of something using the software, and then that's your homework. Okay. I think, oh, I'm on the website. I think that's it in terms of, oh, I do have, do I? Maybe not. Nope, I don't. That's it. So what do you think of that? That's what I've got for you today. That's my discussion on lighting for you for now. I got a little bit more. Oh, I wanted to show you something. You see kind of peeking out from behind me in the background, I got what I call Mr. White, which is a styrofoam head that I got from, where did I get this? Where did you come from? Michael's Art Supply Store. It's got a hole in the bottom so you can kind of put them on a light stand. And then it's a white styrofoam head, but it's a human face that is three-dimensional. And if you have some lighting in your house and you want to experiment with positioning lights in real 3D reality, you can do this with these styrofoam heads. They cost about 10 bucks, maybe 15 bucks from Michael's. And what I did is I took one and I painted it gray, because you can see how the white styrofoam head is really reflective and can sort of work against you when you're trying to create shape with light. So what I did is I took some neutral gray, I think it's primer, and I sprayed Mr. White gray so that I can use the gray head to experiment with lighting. And you can see that the gray head gives you more sort of shadow action and things like that. If I go with a different source on Mr. Gray than my soft overhead source, and I control it, if I dim it down, whoops, there we go. If I dim it down so it's not so intense, I'm trying to dim it down. There we go. Right? You can create more shadows that way. And you can see with the gray head, the way the shadows work when we turn Mr. Gray into his light source and start turning him away from his light source. You can kind of see how that's going to work, right? If I put a white card on the other side of Mr. Gray, I can bring up his shadow side with a white reflector card. You see that? So you can do a little playing that's a little bit more informative in reality in 3D space using these little styrofoam heads. Just put it on the end of a light stand or on your tripod, or stick it on the back of a chair in the dining room or the kitchen, just something to hold it up. And you know, experiment with turning your subject into your light and away from your light, and see how the shadows develop along the jawline, the cheekbones, the eye sockets, the nose, right? The ear, right? And this can be a very helpful tool when you're trying to think about these things in a purely research sort of context. I don't know why that thing won't dim. I might have to repair it. Anyway, I suggest trying a styrofoam head and having fun with that. So that's the lighting discussion. And I'm interested on your thoughts. And, you know, if you have any questions, I'd love to address those here before I let you guys go. Is there anything on anybody's mind based on what I've shown you today?
I did have a question. So
Here's another neat tool that I got for about 10 bucks online. It's an LED tube. Here's, whoops, there's the effect aspect of the show. It has 4 levels of intensity. If I turn my overhead back off and show you, I can experiment with shape by moving this tube around my own face and maybe look in the mirror in the bathroom. Here's your Bela Lugosi lighting, your up lighting for scary movies. Here's your side lighting, you know, more frontal, more 3/4 behind. Here's your top lighting, your frontal lighting, and your back lighting, right? So you can experiment with all these different light placements by holding something small. It's not as focused and intense as a flashlight, so it'll have a little bit softer effect on your face if you want to look at it and decide if it's, you know, doing interesting things or not by where you put it, right? And it's kind of like what they were doing in that sort of little video I showed you, that Sparkles and Wine, right? closer to the body. Further away and below is a little fuller, and the closer it goes to your body, the more sort of raky it gets and the more detail you see, like in my beard and in my glasses. And I get this weird sort of Vulcan looking shadow going on up there. And if I wanted to look really scary, I might do stuff like that, right? I don't know. Something to play with and something to try. I think this cost $10 online, and it's a really kind of a neat tool. It does 4 levels of intensity, and then it does this sort of strobe effect, and then you charge it up by plugging it in with a USB wall adapter, and one charge lasts like a really long time. They're really good on power, so it's a fun little tool to play with. It's called Oxylight, I think. Yeah, Oxy LED is the logo. And if you look for those online, it's a whatever that SKU number means. I don't know. But anyway, I got them at Walmart online for like $9.99. So what do you think? Any questions, comments, critique?
Yeah. So I was gonna ask. Obviously, you want to use your set lighting to
I
expose
don't
your
hear
image.
you, Robert. Are you on mute?
Hello.
Can you hear any of us?
I mean, I can hear you guys.
Yeah, I can hear everybody.
I don't think he can hear us.
Hello.
Try
Hi.
switching to your onboard computer microphone from whatever you're piping in externally. That might help. While you're figuring that out, does anybody else have any questions or observations about the lecture?
Testing, 1,
Seems
2.
like I held
1, 2.
everybody this time till
you
the
hear?
very end, which is cool.
No, I can hear you.
Nobody bailed
yeah,
out
Clayton,
on
I got
I
you.
don't think you can
Got
hear
me?
any.
I hear you, Clayton.
So wait, we can hear.
Yeah, so
What do you think?
I can
He
I
can
can hear
hear
everybody.
There, Mariah,
That's pretty good. That's pretty good.
are you all lighting experts now?
I think
wouldn't
so.
say that.
Maybe, possibly.
Can you
I'd say I
see
learned
the
something.
fun aspects of this? Can you see how there's a lot of room for creativity and experimentation? Can you see the possibilities for the nonverbal communication I was talking about by effective placement of your lights and by color and intensity and contrast? How you can imply certain feelings in the lighting?
Yes.
I go into that at greater length in cinematography too. Themed and expressive lighting, because I think, like I said, I think it's I'm the only one that can't hear us. That's odd. Well, sorry about that, folks. MacBook Pro speakers, MacBook Pro microphone, nothing's changed on my end. I'm going to have to rely on the written chat, or how odd. This has never happened before. Sorry, folks. At any rate, I think that especially with that app, the Zvork app, I think it's a lot of fun, and you can learn a lot just by having that little app on your. I don't know, maybe you can use it on your phone if you got a big enough screen to where you can see the images effectively. Certainly works on a tablet. I use it on a laptop. But it's a lot of fun. It's a great rainy day activity. If you can't go outside and you can't get to campus to rent some lights and, but you still want to play around. That's why I like those apps, both the depth of field simulator and the virtual lighting studio, because you just need a comfy place to sit down, maybe a cold drink or even a cocktail, and the internet, and you're good to go. So that's it then. That's all I have for you in terms of a lighting discussion. If you have a question and you want to type it into the chat for me, since I'm having difficulty hearing for some reason, You can do that, and I'll try to address it here for you. Otherwise, we can adjourn, and you guys can revisit the recording as often as you need to on YouTube. Should we adjourn the session at this point? Can I get a thumbs up in response to, okay. All right. Well, I guess we're good to go. That's 4 thumbs up. So thank you for your time and attention today. Last class is Wednesday. We'll talk about shot design, framing, and composition. You guys should have turned in your homework assignment last night by midnight. If not, remember, you can turn it in late, but it's 10 points per day unless I spoke to you ahead of time and approved a late submission. Your final will open up after Wednesday's class, and you can take that as early as Wednesday afternoon. I recommend studying a little bit first. And yeah, I did have a question finally. Have you ever worked with lighting such as just a lighter, like a cigarette lighter? Yes, I have. I've used flashlights, cigarette lighters, computer screens, all kinds of stuff to use as light sources. And that's kind of where the interactive lighting and the LED lighting with screens sort of kind of happened organically as far back as, say, Iron Man, for instance, where Mike Bauman and Maddie Lebetique were using LED screens with programmed video to flicker and flash organically, and used actual TV screens as light sources, so that when they were photographing Iron Man's face inside the Iron Man helmet, rather than have a steady light source on Iron Man that doesn't really look interactive at all, because supposedly he had, screens appearing in his visor and information that he was reading, the interactive organic quality of the video playing back on the TV screen worked more effectively as a light source than just a steady constant light source. And so that was, is, to my mind, some of the earliest approaches to interactive lighting that were being used on feature films as far back as 12 years ago, I guess. 12, 15 years. And now we got things like Mandalorian going on where they're using all kinds of things for light sources. And so, yeah, yes, I have, is the short answer to that question. I like using them to create a lot more contrast of values in a shot. Sure, absolutely. Because remember, the lighter, the flame coming out of that cigarette lighter is a lot like the flame on a candle. And a candle is a contrasty specular light source. So your lighter is equally contrasty and specular. And the closer it is to your subject, the brighter it appears, the further away it is, the dimmer it is, but it stays contrasty no matter what, because it's a very small, bright source of illumination. If you were to take that lighter, and we have giant panels of diffusion gel and fabric that we use on film sets, and if you put that lighter behind it and the diffusion acts on the light source, it'll spread it out, soften the contrast, and help it wrap around the subject more, so the shadows aren't as contrasty and hard. And then you're doing what we call modifying the light source, and you turn a specular point source of a highlight into a broader, softer, indirect light source, right? But if you want bokeh and you want the cigarette lighter in the scene somewhere in the background, and you want that flame to sort of blob out into a soft, out of focus ball by opening up to a wide aperture with a narrow depth of field and focusing on the foreground, that specular source will turn into a nice, happy little bokeh ball in the background. And if you had 100 of them behind me, imagine the twinkly sort of effect you could get on a really wide aperture with a bunch of specular sources in the background. So I love playing with lighting. I like it even more than cameras, and cameras can be fun, but lighting to me was always the most obvious and expressive means of creating images, because it's obvious on the screen what you're doing. You know, you can bury camera technique behind the scenes and it's not visible to the audience, but your lighting is right there for everybody to look at and evaluate and react to. And so I always thought that lighting was the stronger discipline to understand, and then camera work would change with the manufacturers and their new products, you know. So you're learning a new camera like every 6 months or a year, but the lighting techniques that I use today are the same lighting techniques that I've been using for 30 years. You know, it doesn't matter what camera you use when you're a lighting technician, because the lighting transcends the cameras. One, you know, one decade they're film cameras, the next decade they're video cameras, the decade after that they're digital digital cameras. You know, the camera didn't matter really, not appreciably across those three generations, but the lighting style, the lighting context, the techniques, a lot of that stuff remains the same. Even the tools in many cases, although we got more LEDs than we ever had before, but even the tools are very transcendent of all those different generations of camera capture. So I think, you know, in that respect, the lighting has been super important to both to understand, to practice with, and to utilize in filmmaking. Lighting tells the camera how to think. To some degree, yeah, to some degree it does. It informs the operator how to adjust the camera, certainly. The key light is helping us, you know, I mean, set the key light to what you like, shape-wise, color-wise, position-wise, then check it with a meter and see what the meter is telling you to do with the camera. And if it tells you to use an f-stop that you don't like, that would be too much depth of field, let's say, dim the light until the meter gives you a brighter, lower f-stop. And that's how you can get that softer depth of field going on. Now, all of these different aspects of your cinematography are coming into play. Your lighting, your exposure understanding, your depth of field problems or goals, right? And you're going to manipulate all of those variables to craft the final image, right? It becomes, you know, I've been spoon feeding you these concepts every week, one concept at a time, to help you understand each faction of what I'm doing. And now in the final moments of the semester, I'm kind of springing it on you. Do you see what happens when you mix all these ingredients together, how you can really affect the outcomes of your imagery? And that's kind of the essence of the course now in a nutshell. In these final moments, you're seeing how it all comes together, and how at each stage in this semester, I've showed you how to control each aspect of the image in a certain way, so that by the end of this whole experience, you now have a whole palette of controls that you can enforce on your imagery to get it to come out the way you want, instead of merely taking what's in front of you and saying, this is what it is, because it's not. Cinematography is about control. It's about the deliberate manipulation of all of these forces and factors into predetermined images. Okay. So you're now starting to see the point of this class in a nutshell. Okay. I hope that helps and makes sense to you. It looks like the questions have slowed or stopped rolling in, so that's cool. So with that being said, I again bid you a good afternoon. Wednesday is our last class, so I'll see you bright and early for Wednesday. Don't forget about your homework. Don't forget about your final. Thanks for your time and attention, and I'll see you in a couple of days. All right, folks. Thanks a lot. Have a good afternoon. Sorry about the technical problems, but I'll figure it out for Wednesday. All right. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.